My daughter looked me right in the eye at a dinner table surrounded by wealthy strangers and told me to shut up because nobody cared for me and I was just taking up space. I simply placed my napkin down, took my keys, and never came back to that life again. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Cornell Jenkins. I am 69 years old, and for my entire life I believed that hard work and family loyalty were the only things a man truly needed to leave a lasting legacy. I spent 4 decades building a massive regional logistics fleet from a single-use delivery truck, eventually securing a quiet, unpretentious life for my family. I sat quietly at the end of the massive mahogany dining table inside the sprawling estate I had secretly financed with my own retirement funds. The room buzzed with the forced, superficial laughter of wealthy venture capitalists. Standing at the head of the table, my white son-in-law Bradley commanded the room. His tailored designer suit cost more than my first commercial delivery truck. Pouring expensive red wine into the crystal glasses of his potential investors, he boasted loudly about the extensive new renovations planned for the property. Gesturing toward the large bay windows, he described a massive cantilevered deck he intended to build over the steep southern ridge of the estate. I listened to his arrogant, performative pitch with growing concern. Knowing the geological survey of that specific ridge like the back of my hand, I understood the soil composition was entirely unstable and prone to shifting during heavy rains. Building a cantilevered structure there clearly violated local zoning permits and would inevitably collapse the foundation of the main house. Waiting for a brief pause in his self-congratulatory speech, I cleared my throat and attempted to politely correct his dangerous structural assumptions. I softly explained that the bedrock on the southern slope could not support the sheer weight of steel and concrete without a massive, expensive retention wall. I tried to save him from a catastrophic financial and legal mistake that could destroy the property. The wealthy investors immediately fell into a heavy, awkward silence. They exchanged nervous glances, their wine glasses suspended halfway to their mouths. My daughter Monica sat across from me, her face flushed with sudden, unadulterated rage. Slamming her crystal wine glass onto the mahogany table with enough force to threaten shattering the fragile stem, she created a sharp, violent sound that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of the dining room. She glared at me with absolute contempt, her eyes devoid of any familial warmth. She snapped that I needed to shut up immediately. She stated in a cold, venomous tone that nobody cared for me here and that I was just taking up space. The air in the room grew unbearably thick. I looked at the daughter I had raised, the child whose Ivy League education I had funded through endless, grueling night shifts at the dispatch center. Bradley did not attempt to diffuse the tension or apologize for his wife's brutal outburst. Instead, he let out a loud, mocking laugh. Waving his hand dismissively, he told the silent investors to completely ignore me, loudly proclaiming that I was just a confused old man living in the past who did not understand modern architectural vision. He looked at me with a smirk that communicated profound disrespect, fully assuming I would simply lower my head, swallow my pride, and accept the public humiliation as I always did to keep the peace. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not offer a single word of defense or engage in a shouting match. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the expectation of an ugly, escalating family argument. I simply looked at Monica, registering the cold, undeniable reality of what she had allowed herself to become under the influence of her husband's greed. Taking my linen napkin from my lap, I folded it with meticulous, deliberate care and placed it perfectly beside my untouched dinner plate. I stood up slowly from the table, feeling the weight of my years but maintaining perfect posture. Every eye in the room was fixed on me, wide with uncomfortable anticipation. Walking past the row of wealthy investors without acknowledging their presence, I moved past Bradley, who still wore his arrogant, triumphant smirk. Navigating deliberately toward the front foyer of the grand house, I picked up my car keys from the antique credenza near the entrance. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the dark, freezing night. A torrential rain had begun to fall, washing over the manicured driveway. Walking straight to my old, reliable sedan, I completely ignored the cold rain soaking through my shirt. I started the engine and drove away from the estate, leaving behind the toxic illusion of family I had funded for far too long. I drove through the heavy downpour toward the opposite side of the city, seeking distance from the sprawling estate. Pulling into the brightly lit parking lot of a modest mid-tier hotel near the highway, my mind operated with absolute razor-sharp clarity despite my soaked clothes. Approaching the front desk, I requested a standard room for the night. Handing the night clerk my standard debit card, I expected a simple transaction. The young man swiped the plastic through his machine, frowned, tapped the screen a few times, and swiped it a second time with a bit more force. Looking up at me with an apologetic expression, he gently informed me that the card had been completely declined by the bank. I thanked him quietly, my heart beginning to race with an unfamiliar dread, and stepped away from the counter. Sitting down on a worn leather sofa in the corner of the quiet hotel lobby, I pulled my phone from my damp pocket and opened my secure banking application. I navigated directly to the joint account I shared with Monica. It was an emergency fund explicitly designated to cover my monthly medical expenses and basic living costs. I had personally deposited $50,000 into that specific account just 2 weeks ago. Staring at the glowing screen in sheer disbelief, I saw the available balance displayed a perfect zero. The money was completely gone. The disrespect at the dinner table was not just arrogance. It was the final calculated act of a devastating financial betrayal. The lobby of the mid-tier hotel smelled of cheap bleach and stale coffee. I sat down on a worn leather sofa near the vending machines. Panic is a luxury I discarded decades ago when I built my logistics fleet from a single rusted delivery truck. I breathed evenly and opened my mobile banking application. The screen illuminated the dark truth. The joint account I shared with Monica held exactly $0. I had personally deposited $50,000 into that specific fund just 2 weeks ago to cover my upcoming medical assessments and daily living costs. I tapped the screen to open the transaction history. The money had not simply vanished. It had been systematically drained through a series of consecutive $5,000 transfers over the past week. I traced the routing numbers meticulously. Every single transfer was routed directly into a newly formed limited liability company. A quick search on the state registry database confirmed my darkest suspicion. The company was registered exclusively to Bradley. He had siphoned the exact funds meant to keep me alive. I stared at the digital ledger. I had spent 40 years navigating ruthless freight contracts and corporate sabotage, always keeping my family insulated from the brutality of the business world. I had assumed the greatest threats to my legacy were external competitors. I had been entirely wrong. The threat was sleeping in the master bedroom of the estate I purchased. Bradley had not just insulted me at the dinner table, he had confidently robbed me, assuming my silence was a symptom of ignorance. He believed my advanced age made me an easy target. He did not realize that a man who survived the cutthroat transport industry of the 1980s knows exactly how to systematically dismantle a common thief. My phone vibrated against my palm. A text message illuminated the screen. It was from Monica. I opened the message expecting some form of weak justification or perhaps a belated apology. There was no apology. The text was a blistering demand. Monica commanded me to return to the estate immediately. She stated that my abrupt departure had severely embarrassed Bradley in front of his wealthy venture capitalist friends. She claimed I had ruined a critical networking opportunity for his startup. The message continued with a chilling ultimatum. She wrote that if I continued to act erratically and wander off into the night, she would be forced to hire a full-time memory care nurse. She explicitly threatened to legally document my declining mental state to ensure I could no longer embarrass them in public. I read the words 3 times. My own daughter was using my age as a weapon. She was laying the groundwork to declare me legally incompetent. This was not a sudden burst of anger from a spoiled child. This was a calculated legal strategy. She needed me back at the house, not out of love, but to maintain absolute control over her narrative. If I was a confused old man who wandered away from dinner, my financial complaints could be easily dismissed as senile paranoia. I remembered the long nights I worked double shifts at the dispatch center just to afford her private school tuition. I gave her everything to ensure she never faced the poverty I fought so hard to escape. She had weaponized that very privilege against me. I locked my phone and placed it in my pocket. I would not reply. A response would only give her the engagement she desperately craved. I walked back to the reception desk. The young clerk looked at me with a mixture of pity and discomfort. I reached past my standard leather wallet and opened a hidden compartment. I pulled out a heavy metal corporate credit card. Monica and Bradley knew absolutely nothing about this specific account. It was tied directly to the commercial trust of my former logistics empire. I handed the card to the clerk. He processed the payment, and the machine approved the transaction instantly without a single hesitation. I took my room key and walked toward the elevator. The reality of the situation settled firmly into my bones. My daughter viewed me entirely as a disposable asset. She had reduced the man who raised her to a financial resource to be drained and a social nuisance to be managed. The grief of losing my child to greed threatened to overwhelm me, but I pushed the emotion down entirely. Grief is a useless emotion when you are standing on an active battlefield. I entered the modest hotel room and sat at the small wooden desk. I pulled out a notepad and a pen. I had spent my entire life building protective walls around my family. Now I needed to use the exact legal avenues I utilized to build my wealth to tear those walls down. Bradley thought he was dealing with a vulnerable retiree. He was actually dealing with a veteran businessman who understood the precise mechanics of financial warfare. I drafted a timeline of my next steps. I would not yell. I would not argue. I would sever their financial lifelines cleanly and surgically. I watched the clock on the nightstand slowly tick toward dawn. I was ready to initiate a full legal destruction. At exactly 6 a.m, I drove to the downtown financial district. I walked into the private offices of Gregory, my ruthless corporate attorney. Gregory had managed my freight contracts and corporate acquisitions for 3 decades. He poured 2 cups of black coffee and sat across from me at his massive conference table. I slid my phone across the wood, displaying the drained bank accounts and Monica's threatening text message. I told Gregory I needed a quiet, immediate forensic audit of every single asset tied to my name. Gregory did not ask unnecessary questions. He turned to his computer and accessed the county public property records. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Gregory turned his monitor toward me. The drained cash accounts were merely a distraction. Bradley had executed a far more devastating maneuver. According to the master deed, a $4 million secondary commercial mortgage had been taken out against my estate just 2 days ago. I stared at the digital document in absolute shock. I owned that property outright. I had never authorized a loan against my home. Gregory opened the guarantor forms attached to the mortgage. At the bottom of the final page was my signature. It was a flawless forgery. Bradley had illegally leveraged the entire value of my estate to secure massive funding for his failing tech startup. He had stolen my foundation right out from under my feet. Gregory looked at me with cold, professional fury. He stated that Bradley had committed federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The conflict had instantly escalated from a family dispute into a major criminal conspiracy. I drank my coffee. I instructed Gregory to find exactly where that $4 million was currently resting. Gregory slid a heavy manila folder across the polished mahogany conference table. He did not offer any softening words or pointless sympathy. He simply opened the file and laid the fraudulent commercial mortgage documents flat under the harsh fluorescent lights of his office. I leaned forward and examined the paperwork closely. The ink on the primary guarantor line was completely flawless. It was a perfect replication of the distinct looping signature I used exclusively for high-level corporate authorizations. I stared at the dark blue ink, feeling a cold, calculating realization wash over me. Bradley had not simply practiced copying my handwriting on a scratch pad. He had gained unauthorized access to my private study at the estate. He had bypassed the mechanical lock on my antique desk and stolen the encrypted physical drive that housed my registered digital notary stamp. I had explicitly instructed Monica never to let anyone enter that room under any circumstances. She had clearly ignored my directive, or worse, she had actively held the door open for him while he looted my files. The sheer audacity of the theft required a level of premeditation that eliminated any possibility of a simple financial misunderstanding. Bradley had systematically researched the exact legal mechanism required to leverage a commercial property of that magnitude. He had isolated the specific digital token necessary to bypass standard bank verification protocols. He used the very tools I acquired to streamline my urban construction contracts to effectively steal my foundation. I ran my finger over the raised seal on the final page of the loan agreement. The document authorized a $4 million extraction against a property I had spent 20 years paying off. The betrayal was absolute and entirely clinical. Bradley had looked at me at that dinner table knowing he had already signed my financial death warrant. Gregory asked me why I never simply transferred the deed to Monica after my wife Patricia passed away 5 years ago. I kept my gaze fixed on the fraudulent signature. I explained to Gregory that Patricia and I had built our wealth from nothing, navigating a ruthless urban construction industry that offered no second chances to a young black couple trying to break into commercial logistics. When Patricia died, Monica expected to immediately inherit the sprawling estate and the liquid assets attached to it. I refused to sign the transfer. I recognized exactly what Bradley was the moment he stepped into our home. He was a man who lived entirely on projected wealth, funneling millions of dollars of venture capital into a series of hollow, failing technology startups. He possessed no actual business acumen, only an endless appetite for unearned status and a quiet disdain for the grueling labor that built my fortune. I placed the estate and the core commercial assets into a blind trust to build an impenetrable wall around Monica. I wanted to ensure she would never lose her home when Bradley's inevitable financial collapse finally occurred. I believed my careful legal maneuvering would entirely insulate my daughter from her husband's reckless incompetence. I was entirely wrong. My protective wall did not insulate her at all. It merely provided a massive untapped reservoir for their criminal greed. By keeping the assets secure and hidden, I inadvertently created the ultimate prize for a man desperate to cover his mounting failures. Bradley did not see my trust as a safety net for his wife. He saw it as a $4 million vault waiting to be cracked. My attempt to shield my family had directly armed the enemy sleeping under my own roof. Gregory closed the manila folder and reached for his desk phone. He stated in a flat, clinical tone that we needed to contact the Financial Crimes Division of the local police department immediately. He advised that a swift arrest was the only way to stop Bradley from doing further damage to the trust. I placed my hand firmly over his phone and shook my head. I informed Gregory that calling the authorities right now would be a catastrophic tactical error. Bradley was a coward, but he was a cornered coward with potential access to $4 million. If he sensed a police investigation closing in, he would instantly wire the remaining funds into untraceable offshore shell companies and hire a defense team to tie up the estate in litigation for a decade. He would bleed my legacy dry through endless legal fees while fighting the charges from a luxury resort. I refused to let him control the battlefield. I instructed Gregory to initiate a silent, comprehensive forensic audit of every single account routing number and corporate entity associated with Bradley. We needed to trace every stolen penny before we alerted him to our knowledge of the crime. Gregory cautioned that waiting even 24 hours was an enormous risk that could result in total capital loss. I reminded him that I had spent 40 years managing volatile supply chains and negotiating with ruthless city contractors. You do not strike a thief when he is hiding in the shadows. You strike a thief when he is reaching for the money in broad daylight. I needed Bradley to feel completely secure in his arrogance. I needed him to firmly believe his meticulous forgery was a total undetected success. Gregory nodded slowly and turned back to his secure computer terminal. He launched an immediate trace on the loan disbursement using the forged account numbers listed in the contract. The rapid clicking of his keyboard filled the heavy silence of the office. He suddenly stopped typing and stared intensely at the screen. He informed me that the $4 million had not yet vanished. The bank had flagged the massive offshore routing request as a high-tier security risk. The capital was currently sitting frozen in a temporary holding account. Gregory explained that the bank's fraud prevention protocol required one final verification step before releasing the funds to Bradley's overseas shell company. They needed a physical, freshly signed proxy form from the primary account holder to authorize the international wire transfer. The bank had imposed a strict 48-hour deadline on the hold. If the signed proxy form was not submitted within 2 days, the transfer would be permanently canceled, and the loan would trigger an automatic federal fraud review. I looked at Gregory as the pieces of Bradley's desperate puzzle snapped into perfect alignment. Bradley did not demand I return to the estate simply because I embarrassed him at a dinner party. He needed me back in that house because his entire scheme was stalling. He required my actual physical signature on a proxy document within 48 hours to unlock the stolen millions. My sudden departure into the rainy night had entirely derailed his carefully orchestrated timeline. The escalating threats from Monica were a direct result of his absolute panic. He was waiting for me at the estate right now, holding the final document he needed to complete the theft. I drove my sedan back through the towering wrought iron gates of the estate just as the morning sun began to pierce the heavy rain clouds. I parked in my usual spot near the garden shed and walked slowly up the limestone steps to the main entrance. I adjusted my posture to mimic the exact physical decline they so desperately wanted to see in me. I let my shoulders slump and slowed my pace. Monica was waiting in the grand foyer. She wore a pristine designer robe, tapping her foot with impatient irritation. I stepped inside and immediately offered a quiet, hesitant apology. I told her the noise at the dinner party had simply overwhelmed me and that I had driven to a nearby diner to clear my head, but had somehow lost track of time. I watched her face transform from anger into a cold, triumphant satisfaction. She genuinely believed her father was deteriorating right in front of her eyes. She patted my arm with condescending pity. She told me I needed to rest because wandering off in the middle of the night was a clear sign that my mind was failing. She instructed me to go straight to the kitchen to take my morning vitamins. Her absolute blindness to my actual state of mind was her greatest weakness. She had spent her entire life surrounded by the wealth I built, yet she never once bothered to learn how I actually built it. She assumed age equated to fragility. I nodded obediently and walked toward the kitchen, leaning slightly against the wall for dramatic effect. I knew Bradley was waiting for me. Bradley stood leaning against the marble kitchen island. He held a thick ceramic mug of artisan coffee in one hand and a manila folder in the other. The frantic desperation I expected to see in his eyes was perfectly masked behind a slick, rehearsed smile. He set his coffee down and approached me with the smooth, calculating cadence of a desperate salesman. He placed a gentle, patronizing hand on my shoulder and guided me toward one of the high-backed bar stools. He spoke in a soft, overly patient tone, the kind reserved for young children. He claimed he had spent the entire morning dealing with the state medical board on my behalf. He opened the folder and slid a neat stack of legal documents across the granite countertop. He explained that my current health insurance policy required immediate manual updates due to my advancing age and recent erratic behavior. He insisted the state needed a physical signature to authorize a comprehensive secondary care plan. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen and tapped the bottom right corner of the top page. He stressed that we only had a small window of time to file the paperwork before my medical coverage lapsed completely. He looked at me with an expression of total, unearned confidence. He firmly believed I was too exhausted and too confused to read the fine print. I picked up the heavy pen. I adjusted my reading glasses and looked down at the thick stack of paper. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to stand there and wait. I read the dense legal jargon with the trained eye of a man who spent 40 years negotiating brutal commercial logistics contracts. The documents had absolutely nothing to do with health insurance coverage or state medical boards. Beneath a highly deceptive cover page, the packet contained a comprehensive, irrevocable power of attorney. The clauses were aggressively structured to grant Bradley absolute, uncontested control over my entire financial portfolio, my physical estate, and all of my future medical decisions. Tucked neatly near the back of the packet was the specific proxy authorization form the bank required to release the $4 million from the frozen escrow vault. Bradley had packaged the ultimate theft inside a fabricated medical emergency. I kept my breathing slow and even. I remembered the exact moment my late wife Patricia and I bought this land. We had stood in an empty, overgrown field and envisioned a fortress that would protect our family for generations. Bradley was attempting to steal that fortress using cheap trickery and a gold fountain pen. I looked up at my son-in-law. His jaw was tight with barely concealed anxiety. A single bead of sweat formed at his temple despite the cool air conditioning of the kitchen. He urged me to sign quickly, claiming he had an urgent meeting with his development team in the city. I nodded slowly. I told him I appreciated his diligence in managing my complicated affairs. I uncapped the fountain pen. I pressed the gold nib against the thick parchment. I did not use the flowing, distinct signature that secured my corporate empire. I utilized a very specific, carefully constructed variation of my name. 30 years ago, during a hostile takeover attempt by a rival freight conglomerate, Gregory and I established a designated distress signature. It involved a broken loop on the capital letter and a missing period after my middle initial. This specific variation was legally registered as an immediate silent indicator of coercion. Any contract bearing that exact flaw was instantly rendered null and void, immediately triggering an automatic fraud alert within my primary trust network. I moved the pen across the signature lines on all 6 pages, flawlessly executing the toxic forgery against myself. I handed the pen back to Bradley. He practically snatched the documents from the marble counter. He did not bother to review the ink. He quickly shoved the papers back into the manila folder and let out a sharp, breathless exhale of relief. His slick, patronizing facade cracked for a split second, revealing a deeply pathetic man who thought he had just secured his salvation. He grinned triumphantly, patted my back one final time, and practically sprinted out of the kitchen toward the garage. He had no idea he was carrying a legally radioactive document. I sat quietly at the marble island and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I had just handed him the exact rope he needed to hang himself. I sat in the leather wingback chair in the reading room, watching the antique grandfather clock tick away exactly 2 hours since Bradley had practically sprinted out the front door with his legally toxic documents. The heavy oak front door chimed open. Monica walked into the reading room, accompanied by a tall, sharply dressed white man carrying a black leather medical bag. His suit was expensive, but his posture carried the distinct arrogance of someone used to being unquestioned. Monica stood beside him, clasping her hands together in a display of manufactured concern. She offered a tight, artificial smile and introduced the man as Dr. Eris Thorne, a private concierge physician she claimed to have hired out of deep affection for my well-being. She stated smoothly that he was simply here to conduct a routine wellness check given my supposed erratic behavior the previous night. She used a tone dripping with false sweetness, the kind of voice a person uses to coax a frightened animal into a cage. The doctor did not offer to shake my hand. He looked down at me over the rim of his silver glasses, assessing me not as a patient, but as a minor hurdle standing between him and a lucrative payout. I knew precisely why he was standing in my house. Gregory had warned me that Bradley and Monica would need a certified medical declaration of incompetence to fortify the fraudulent power of attorney. This man was not here to check my vitals. He was a paid mercenary brought in to rubber stamp my institutionalization. I did not object. I gestured calmly to the empty chair across from me and invited the doctor to begin his assessment. Dr. Thorne opened his leather bag and retrieved a pristine clipboard. He did not pull out a stethoscope or a blood pressure cuff. He clicked his expensive ballpoint pen and immediately launched into a psychological battery. His questions were not designed to evaluate my health. They were aggressively leading structured specifically to manufacture a paper trail of severe cognitive decline. He spoke loudly and slowly, adopting a cadence thick with blatant ageism and racial condescension. He asked if I knew what day it was, tilting his head with exaggerated patience. He inquired if I often forgot where I placed my belongings, or if I struggled to comprehend complex financial documents. He asked these questions while glancing around the opulent reading room, his eyes lingering on the mahogany shelves and original oil paintings. His expression communicated a silent, insulting assumption that an elderly black man could not possibly have acquired such an estate through legitimate intellectual labor. He patronized me, asking if I ever felt overwhelmed by the sheer size of the house, suggesting that a smaller supervised facility would be much more suitable for someone of my background and advanced years. Monica stood near the doorway watching the interrogation with cold satisfaction. She believed the trap was closing flawlessly around me. She thought her expensive hired gun was successfully painting me into a corner of undeniable senility. I sat perfectly still, letting him fill the quiet room with his arrogant assumptions. I allowed him to dig the hole as deep as he possibly could before I decided to take the shovel away from him. I waited until the doctor finished a particularly insulting question regarding my ability to manage a basic checking account. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and locked my gaze entirely onto his. I answered him with terrifying, unwavering precision. I stated the current date, the exact time down to the minute, and the current ambient temperature of the room. I then smoothly transitioned from my own details to his. I recited his full legal name, his date of birth, and his state medical license number without missing a single digit. The condescending smile vanished from Dr. Thorne's face instantly. I did not stop. I maintained a calm, conversational tone as I detailed the exact parameters of a severe medical malpractice lawsuit he had quietly settled exactly 2 years and 4 months ago. I recited the specific financial penalty he was forced to pay to avoid losing his license entirely. I quoted a line from the plaintiff's affidavit, a detail I had memorized from the extensive background check Gregory had run on every associate tied to Bradley's shell company. I watched the blood completely drain from the doctor's face. His arrogant posture collapsed. I calmly informed him that aiding and abetting a fraudulent transfer of assets carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. I asked him if his concierge fee was truly worth trading his luxury practice for a concrete cell. I let the silence hang in the air, thick and suffocating. I remained perfectly still, watching his breathing grow shallow and frantic. The man who had walked in expecting to bully a confused old man was now staring directly at an apex predator. Dr. Thorne did not utter another word. Sheer panic overtook his professional facade. He aggressively shoved his clipboard and his expensive pen back into his black leather medical bag, his hands trembling so violently he could barely clasp the brass buckle. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the heavy antique chair in his frantic rush to escape. He turned his back on me and practically sprinted toward the foyer. Monica's look of cold satisfaction shattered into utter confusion. She chased after him down the wide hallway, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. I remained seated in my chair, listening as her voice echoed through the house. She grabbed the doctor's arm near the front door, demanding to know where he was going. She shrieked that she had paid him an exorbitant upfront fee and demanded he hand over the signed certificate of incompetence immediately. The doctor violently pulled his arm out of her grasp. He shouted that he would not participate in a federal crime and explicitly warned her to never contact his office again. He threw open the heavy front door and fled down the limestone steps, leaving Monica standing alone in the grand entryway. She slowly turned around and looked back down the hallway toward the reading room. Her face was pale, stripped of all its former arrogance. The realization finally hit her with the force of a physical blow. She realized I was not declining. She realized I was completely lucid, exceptionally informed, and incredibly dangerous. She stared at me from the distance, finally understanding that the old man she thought she had trapped was actually the one holding the cage closed. Bradley drove his imported sports car well above the speed limit down the interstate, treating the morning traffic as a mere inconvenience. He parked diagonally across two spaces directly in front of the regional headquarters of my primary financial institution, completely ignoring the painted lines. He practically sprinted through the heavy revolving glass doors, clutching the manila folder against his chest as if it contained the winning ticket to a massive lottery. He bypassed the standard teller line entirely and marched straight toward the Premier Client Services desk. He slapped the heavily forged power of attorney documents and the signed proxy release form onto the polished granite counter with a sharp smack. He demanded the immediate attention of a senior wire specialist. He did not speak with the polite professionalism required for corporate transactions of this magnitude. He barked his orders, treating the experienced bank staff like incompetent subordinates who were actively wasting his time. He presented his personal identification alongside the toxic documents, loudly instructing the clerk to finalize the $4 million international wire transfer to his offshore shell company located in the Cayman Islands. He tapped his expensive designer shoes against the marble floor, radiating an arrogant, nervous energy. He loudly complained about the mandated wait time, explicitly reminding the clerk that he was a highly influential venture capitalist whose time was exceptionally valuable. He firmly believed he had executed a flawless criminal maneuver. He stood in the brightly lit lobby, completely unaware that his every movement was being carefully observed from above. He thought the thick stack of paper in his hands was the ultimate key to his financial salvation. He did not realize he was actively delivering the final piece of physical evidence required to guarantee his absolute destruction. Gregory and I were already sitting comfortably inside the bank manager's secure, soundproof office located on the mezzanine level directly above the main lobby. We drank our coffee in total silence, watching the live, high-definition security camera feed displayed on the manager's large wall monitor. We observed Bradley pacing aggressively in front of the premier desk. The branch manager, a seasoned financial officer I had known for 20 years, sat at his desk reviewing the live digital scans of the documents Bradley had just submitted downstairs. The manager zoomed in on the proxy authorization form. He isolated the ink of my signature on his screen. A bright red digital alert instantly flashed across his monitor. The bank's automated security software immediately recognized the broken loop on the capital letter and the strategically omitted period. The system instantly flagged the entire transaction as a coerced and highly fraudulent authorization. The manager looked across his desk at me, his face a mask of cold professional shock. He confirmed that the signature exactly matched the distress protocols established within my commercial trust decades ago. He stated that the documents Bradley had proudly delivered were legally void and constituted indisputable proof of attempted grand larceny. Gregory leaned forward in his chair, folding his hands together on the desk. He reminded the manager that standard protocol dictated freezing the account and summoning private security to detain the individual in the lobby. I shook my head, rejecting the standard procedure entirely. I did not want Bradley quietly escorted out of a bank lobby with a mere warning and a slap on the wrist. I wanted him to hang himself with the absolute certainty of his own success. I instructed the branch manager to bypass the immediate security lockdown and authorize a highly specific financial maneuver known within corporate circles as a ghost transfer. The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second before typing the complex command overrides into his secure terminal. He deliberately manipulated the outgoing digital receipt. The system would generate an official confirmation code and push a notification directly to Bradley's mobile banking application, falsely indicating that the $4 million had successfully cleared the international clearinghouse. In reality, the actual capital would not leave the domestic banking system. The $4 million would be immediately routed into an impenetrable federal escrow vault, heavily monitored and entirely frozen, pending a massive criminal fraud investigation. The manager executed the command. He pressed the final key, authorizing the simulated transaction. The digital trap closed with silent, absolute perfection. The money was safe, completely insulated from Bradley's grasping hands, yet the digital trail would provide him with the exact illusion of a spectacular victory. I watched the security monitor closely. I knew that men like Bradley functioned entirely on the superficial appearance of wealth. Giving him a digital screenshot of $4 million was equivalent to handing him a loaded weapon. He would immediately use that fake confirmation to fund his arrogant lifestyle, effectively spending money that simply did not exist. I finished my coffee feeling a profound sense of closure. The defensive phase of my strategy was officially complete. The offensive phase was about to begin, and Bradley was going to dig his own grave without realizing the ground beneath him had vanished. On the security monitor, we watched Bradley pull his phone from his tailored jacket pocket. His screen illuminated, displaying the fabricated wire confirmation. A massive, triumphant smile broke across his face. He let out a loud, aggressive cheer that echoed across the quiet marble lobby, drawing the annoyed stares of the tellers and waiting customers. He did not care about the disruption. Monica walked through the revolving doors just in time to witness his celebration. Bradley rushed toward her, grabbing her by the waist and kissing her enthusiastically. He waved his glowing phone screen in her face, loudly, declaring that the funds had cleared and that he had finally outsmarted the pathetic old man. Monica smiled with cold, calculating validation, believing her future was permanently secured through their combined deceit. They walked out of the bank together, radiating the toxic confidence of successful thieves. Bradley did not waste a single minute. Standing on the sidewalk in broad daylight, he pulled a sleek leather checkbook from his breast pocket. Operating entirely on the adrenaline of the ghost transfer, he immediately began writing massive checks to his most aggressive private creditors. He signed away hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover the exorbitant debts he had accrued from his string of failed startups. He handed the checks to a waiting courier, acting like a conqueror dispensing spoils. He truly believed he possessed $4 million in untraceable offshore capital. He had absolutely no idea that his accounts were entirely barren. He was eagerly distributing legally binding checks drawn against a vault of thin air. He had just transformed an attempted wire fraud into a cascading series of catastrophic, actionable financial crimes. The very next afternoon, the estate grounds were transformed into a vulgar display of premature victory. Bradley, entirely convinced that his offshore accounts were flush with $4 million of my stolen equity, hosted a lavish catered lunch on the South Lawn. He invited his entire circle of pseudo-intellectual venture capitalists desperate to prove his newly acquired financial dominance. White linen tents were erected across the manicured grass. Waiters in pressed tuxedos carried silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. Bradley moved through the crowd with absolute arrogance. He clapped his associates on the shoulder, loudly boasting about his latest round of phantom funding. He claimed his technology startup was officially poised for a global expansion. Monica stood by his side wearing a newly purchased designer dress, accepting compliments with a practiced, hollow smile. She genuinely believed her husband had finally elevated them above my working-class legacy. I observed the spectacle from the second-floor window of my guest room, remaining entirely out of sight. I watched Bradley pull his sleek leather checkbook from the breast pocket of his Italian suit. Operating under the absolute certainty of his digital ghost transfer, he aggressively signed away massive sums of money. He handed a $30,000 check directly to the head caterer, tipping the event coordinator an additional $5,000 as a deliberate theatrical display of his immense wealth. He distributed the checks drawn against his newly established offshore routing numbers with the careless abandon of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. He assumed he was cementing his status among the elite. In reality, he was legally documenting his own financial execution, distributing worthless paper to working professionals who would not tolerate being defrauded. The illusion of Bradley's success did not even last until sunset. Barely 3 hours after the final guest departed the estate, a heavy, urgent pounding echoed against the front door. The head caterer stood on the limestone steps, his face flushed with professional outrage. Bradley opened the door with an arrogant smirk, expecting another compliment on the event. The caterer did not offer pleasantries. He aggressively shoved the $30,000 check against Bradley's chest. He stated in a loud, demanding tone that his bank had instantly rejected the deposit. The paper was completely worthless. Bradley's smirk faltered. He indignantly grabbed the check, insisting there must be a simple clerical error at the local branch. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket to display his offshore balance and silence the angry merchant. The screen illuminated, but the triumphant digital receipt from the previous day had completely vanished. In its place was a severe, red notification banner blocking his access entirely. Bradley aggressively tapped the screen, but his mobile banking application refused to load. His accounts were completely locked. The bank's automated security protocols had detected the massive influx of fraudulent routing numbers combined with his rapid, unfunded, out-of-network check disbursements. The algorithm instantly froze his entire financial profile due to extreme suspicious activity and catastrophic insufficient funds. The caterer stepped forward, physically invading Bradley's personal space. He demanded immediate cash payment, threatening to call the local authorities and press formal theft charges. Bradley visibly recoiled, his false bravado crumbling under the weight of an actual confrontation. He stammered a weak excuse about international wire delays and promised to resolve the issue by morning. The caterer turned and marched down the driveway, promising legal retaliation. Bradley retreated into the grand foyer and slammed the heavy oak door shut. He paced frantically across the marble floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. He immediately dialed his offshore financial liaison in the Cayman Islands, his fingers trembling as he punched in the international country code. The banker answered with a tone of icy detachment, completely stripping away the usual sycophantic respect reserved for wealthy clients. Bradley shouted into the receiver, demanding to know why his accounts were suddenly frozen and why his domestic checks were bouncing across the city. He cited the transfer confirmation he had received exactly 24 hours earlier. The offshore banker remained perfectly calm. He flatly informed Bradley that absolutely no capital had ever arrived in their jurisdiction. He explained that the initial notification was nothing more than a preliminary routing ping, not a verified deposit. The actual $4 million wire transfer had been intercepted and violently halted by a federal escrow vault. The banker stated with brutal clarity that the entire transaction was currently flagged as a catastrophic federal fraud anomaly. The forged signature on the proxy document had triggered an automated domestic security lock, severing the financial pipeline permanently. Furthermore, because Bradley had attempted to push the stolen equity through an international shell company, international banking authorities had instantly severed all ties with his profile to avoid federal prosecution. The banker abruptly disconnected the line, leaving Bradley listening to a dead dial tone. The color completely drained from Bradley's face. He stood frozen in the opulent hallway, his skin turning an unnatural, sickly pale shade. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He had no stolen millions. He had zero liquid assets. The catastrophic failure of his banking application was merely the preamble to his physical destruction. As Bradley stood frozen in the foyer, the heavy wrought iron security gates at the bottom of the estate driveway violently rattled. Two men stepped out of a matte black utility vehicle. They did not look like venture capitalists or technology developers. They were heavily built, their arms covered in thick, dark tattoos spilling out from underneath their tight leather jackets. These were the aggressive private creditors Bradley had turned to when traditional banks refused to fund his failing startup. He had promised to repay them with exorbitant interest the moment his offshore wire cleared. The men bypassed the intercom entirely. They vaulted over the stone perimeter wall with terrifying ease and marched straight up the long manicured driveway. Bradley watched them approach through the large bay windows. His breath hitched in his throat. The creditors stopped directly in front of the main entrance. The larger of the two men did not ring the doorbell. He slammed his heavy fist against the reinforced glass panel, staring directly at Bradley through the window. He shouted with a rough, gravelly voice that their patience was completely exhausted. He demanded the immediate delivery of $2 million in untraceable cash by sunset. He promised that if Bradley failed to produce the money, they would bypass the legal system entirely and extract their payment through physical collateral. Bradley did not attempt to negotiate. He stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of a decorative Persian rug. He scrambled away from the window, his chest heaving with absolute terror. He sprinted toward the interior of the house, frantically locking the deadbolts on every door, entirely trapped inside the very fortress he had attempted to steal. Bradley sprinted up the grand sweeping staircase of the estate, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished oak steps. He burst through the double doors of the master bedroom, his chest heaving with sheer panic. Monica sat at her vanity mirror, casually applying expensive evening makeup, completely oblivious to the violent threat waiting at their front gate. Bradley slammed the heavy bedroom doors shut behind him and immediately turned his absolute terror into vicious anger directed entirely at his wife. He grabbed her by the shoulders and spun her around, screaming that the offshore account was completely frozen. He did not confess his own spectacular failure to secure the money. Instead, he blamed her entirely for the catastrophic collapse of his scheme. He accused her of sabotaging the final proxy authorization document. He shouted that the bank had flagged the transaction because her initial groundwork was fundamentally flawed. He insisted she must have drawn suspicion to the trust during her preliminary conversations with the regional bank managers. He paced furiously across the plush bedroom carpet, wildly pointing his finger at her face. He accused her of ruining the original forgery by being careless with the digital notary stamp she had stolen from my private study. His voice cracked with hysteria as he demanded to know if she had left a digital footprint that alerted the federal auditors to their plan. He told her that two highly aggressive enforcers were currently standing outside the front door, demanding $2 million in cash by sunset. He spat the words at her, declaring that her incompetence had just cost him his entire future and potentially his physical safety. He demanded she find a way to fix the disastrous financial mess she had supposedly created. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed hallway directly outside their master bedroom. The heavy oak doors were thick, but Bradley's hysterical shouting carried clearly through the polished wood. I reached into my tailored trousers and retrieved my mobile phone. I silently activated the high-definition voice recording application and pressed the device flat against the doorframe. I did not move a single muscle as Monica's voice finally erupted over her husband's frantic accusations. She did not cower or apologize. She screamed back at him with a level of pure, unadulterated venom that chilled the blood in my veins. She vehemently rejected his attempt to blame her for the frozen accounts. Her voice echoed down the corridor as she explicitly outlined exactly how much effort she had dedicated to his criminal enterprise. She aggressively reminded him that she was the one who spent 3 agonizing days locked inside my private study, meticulously practicing the distinct loops and angles of my corporate signature. She proudly detailed how she had exhausted pages of tracing paper to ensure the fraudulent commercial mortgage documents looked absolutely flawless to the bank executives. The recording captured her boasting about bypassing my antique desk locks and successfully cloning my encrypted digital notary stamp to an external drive. She yelled that without her brilliant dedicated forgery, Bradley would never have secured the $4 million secondary mortgage in the first place. She demanded he stop acting like a victim and recognize that she had personally orchestrated the theft of my estate to save his pathetic technology startup. I stood in the dark corridor watching the digital audio waveform bounce across my phone screen. Every single word of her spontaneous confession was being permanently preserved as irrefutable, undeniable federal evidence. Monica did not stop at confessing to the mortgage fraud. Her voice rose to a shrill, piercing pitch as she laid out the remainder of her grotesque, long-term strategy. She reminded Bradley of the ultimate goal they had established the night they decided to steal the equity. The recording captured her stating clearly that the forged proxy forms were only the first phase of her plan. She explicitly admitted her intention to use the fraudulent medical incompetence certificate to force me into a severely underfunded state-run psychiatric facility. She argued that paying for a legitimate high-quality private care facility would drain the remaining cash from the estate accounts. She coldly calculated that abandoning me in a miserable forgotten state ward would allow them to keep the absolute maximum amount of my stolen wealth for their own luxury expenses. She rationalized her cruelty by claiming I was already too old to notice the difference in my living conditions. Standing in the silent hallway, I listened to the daughter I had raised eagerly plot my total physical and mental destruction simply to save a few $1,000s. Any tiny, irrational fraction of paternal hope that had managed to survive the events of the past week completely evaporated in that exact moment. The illusion of my family was permanently shattered into dust. I realized I was not listening to a misguided child who had made a terrible financial mistake under the influence of a bad husband. I was listening to a highly calculating predator who viewed my life as a minor inconvenience standing between her and a designer lifestyle. I pressed the button to end the recording and secured the audio file in an encrypted cloud folder. My heart did not ache. It simply turned to absolute impenetrable ice. The vicious argument inside the bedroom reached a sudden, violent climax. Bradley realized Monica could not miraculously produce the missing $4 million. He abruptly stopped yelling. He realized the two aggressive enforcers waiting at the front gate would soon shatter the reinforced glass and tear through the estate. Self-preservation completely overrode any lingering pretense of marital loyalty. He spat a final degrading insult at his wife and turned away from her. I heard the heavy sliding doors of his walk-in closet slam open. He was not looking for a weapon to defend his home. He pulled a large canvas duffel bag from the top shelf and frantically began sweeping his collection of imported luxury watches into the main compartment. He stripped the hidden wall safe of every stack of emergency cash he had hoarded over the past 2 years. Monica realized exactly what he was doing. She demanded to know where he was going. Bradley did not look at her. He zipped the heavy duffel bag shut and hoisted it over his shoulder. He brutally informed her that the men at the gate were not there to repossess furniture. They were there to break bones. He stated clearly that he intended to abandon her to deal with the violent fallout of his failed debts. He intended to slip out through the rear servant exit, jump the back security wall, and flee the state before the local police or the angry creditors realized he was gone. He ripped the heavy bedroom doors open and stormed into the hallway, leaving his wife screaming his name in absolute betrayal. He stopped dead in his tracks, dropping the heavy duffel bag to the polished floor. I was standing directly in his path. I stepped aside smoothly, leaving a wide and clear path to the rear corridor. Bradley did not hesitate or question why I was allowing him to pass without a physical struggle. Sheer panic had completely consumed his capacity for rational thought. He snatched his heavy canvas duffel bag off the polished hardwood floor and sprinted blindly down the hallway, violently shoving the heavy servant's door open. He burst out into the cool, damp evening air and scrambled toward the circular driveway where his sleek imported German sports car was parked. I followed at a steady, measured pace, listening to the frantic slapping of his expensive leather shoes against the smooth paving stones. He hurled his bag onto the passenger seat and threw himself behind the leather steering wheel. Through the tinted windshield, I watched his silhouette frantically jabbing the push-to-start ignition button. The highly engineered motor let out a pathetic dry sputter. It choked on its own mechanical failure and died instantly. He hit the button again and again, slamming his open palm against the steering column in absolute desperation. The digital dashboard flickered briefly and went entirely dark. He was trapped inside a $100,000 paperweight. I walked slowly down the stone steps and stepped out from the deep shadows cast by the towering oak trees. I did not raise my voice or alter my deliberate stride. I stopped directly in front of the slanted hood of his useless vehicle. I raised my right hand, holding up a small, intricate piece of molded plastic and copper wiring. It was the primary electronic distributor relay switch, a vital engine component without which his luxury car could not generate a single spark. I tossed it gently into the air and caught it, letting him stare at the tiny device that had just sealed his fate. He realized he was not going anywhere. Bradley kicked his car door open so violently it rebounded off its engineered hinges. He lunged out of the low driver's seat, his face contorted into a grotesque mask of feral rage. He charged directly toward me, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding I hand over the stolen mechanical part immediately. He threw his arms wildly in the air, attempting to use his height and younger physical bulk to intimidate a man 30 years his senior. He closed the distance between us until he was mere inches from my face, his chest heaving rapidly, his breath reeking of nervous sweat and sheer terror. He balled his hands into tight fists, his knuckles turning stark white as he threatened to beat me into the pavement if I did not fix his vehicle right that very second. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back or lower my intense gaze. I stood absolutely rooted to the stone driveway, meeting his frantic, bulging eyes with a cold, impenetrable calm. I let his violent threats wash over me like empty wind. When he finally stopped shouting to catch his breath, I spoke in a quiet, even tone that carried with crystal clarity through the evening air. I reminded him that I had spent 40 brutal years building the logistical and physical infrastructure of this city from the dirt up. I had negotiated with cutthroat labor unions, overseen massive commercial construction fleets, and broken men 10 times tougher than a cowardly venture capitalist wearing a tailored suit. I told him that a man who knows how to maintain heavy industrial machinery knows exactly how to surgically dismantle a delicate German engine in under 3 minutes. I dropped the relay switch onto the hard pavement and crushed it beneath the heel of my heavy shoe. The distinct, sharp crunching sound echoed perfectly in the quiet driveway. The heavy oak front door of the main house flew open before Bradley could fully register the destruction of his only escape route. Monica rushed out onto the wide limestone steps, her expensive designer evening gown catching the cool breeze. She ran down the illuminated driveway toward us, her face flushed with a volatile mixture of profound betrayal and desperate confusion. She stopped a few feet away, her chest rising and falling heavily as she looked from her husband's panicked expression to the crushed electronic component lying on the ground. She screamed Bradley's name, demanding to know why his car was hastily packed with his luxury watches and entire stash of emergency cash. She hysterically asked why he was attempting to abandon her to deal with the violent creditors who were actively trying to breach the front gates. The last remaining shred of Bradley's polished, loving husband facade instantly dissolved into pure, concentrated malice. He turned on her with absolute disgust. He did not offer apologies or weak excuses. He brutally informed her that she was a completely useless liability. He shouted that he only married her to gain direct proximity to the immense wealth her father had accumulated. And since she had spectacularly failed to secure that wealth, she held absolutely no value to him whatsoever. He called her an incompetent fool who had botched the simplest forgery assignment, ensuring his total financial ruin. He stated with vicious clarity that he would rather take his chances fleeing on foot than spend another minute pretending to care about a woman whose only asset was a bank account that had just been permanently locked by federal authorities. He stripped away years of fabricated romance in a matter of brutal seconds, leaving Monica staring at him in paralyzed horror. She finally saw the true empty nature of the man she had conspired with against her own blood. The sickening crunch of twisting metal violently interrupted Bradley's cruel tirade. A massive reinforced utility truck smashed directly through the towering wrought iron security gates at the bottom of the estate driveway. The heavy iron bars groaned in protest and snapped, tearing away from their thick stone pillars in a brilliant shower of sparks and pulverized concrete. The matte black truck surged forward, its high-beam headlights cutting harshly through the descending darkness, and skidded to an aggressive angular halt, completely blocking the circular exit path. The heavy doors of the vehicle swung open simultaneously. The two heavily tattooed enforcers stepped out onto the pavement carrying thick iron crowbars. They did not rush. They walked slowly up the illuminated driveway with the casual, terrifying confidence of predators who knew their prey had absolutely nowhere left to run. Bradley spun around, his eyes darting frantically from the crushed ruins of the main gates to the high stone perimeter walls surrounding the entire property. Every possible avenue of escape was entirely sealed, the color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His knees buckled under the crushing weight of his inescapable reality. He collapsed onto the hard paving stones right at my feet. The arrogant venture capitalist who had confidently ordered my forced institutionalization just hours prior was now sobbing openly, his tears spilling pathetically onto the driveway. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately clutching the fabric of my trousers. He begged me to intervene. He pleaded with me to write a massive check to call my private bankers to do absolutely anything to save his life from the men approaching him. He promised to sign a full written confession to divorce Monica immediately and to vanish forever if I just paid his debts. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, and took a single deliberate step backward. The larger of the two heavily tattooed enforcers took a slow, menacing step forward, deliberately tapping his thick iron crowbar against his calloused open palm. Bradley cowered pitifully on the cold paving stones, burying his face in his trembling hands, entirely bracing for the crushing physical blow to land. I did not allow the violence to occur on my property. I stepped smoothly out of the deep shadows cast by the towering oak trees, placing myself directly between the weeping venture capitalist and his highly aggressive private creditors. The two men stopped their advance immediately, their eyes narrowing as they rapidly assessed the unexpected situation. They had clearly expected to encounter a frightened, senile old man they could easily push aside. Instead, they faced a man who had spent 4 brutal decades commanding absolute respect in the most cutthroat corporate boardrooms and industrial construction sites in the country. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with an absolute, frigid authority that demanded instant compliance. I informed the men that the ground they were currently standing on belonged exclusively to a heavily fortified corporate trust. I explicitly warned them that any physical assault or property damage committed within the perimeter of this estate would instantly trigger a massive federal investigation into their highly illegal underground lending operation. I reminded them that my private state-of-the-art security network had already captured their faces, their license plates, and their forced violent entry through my front gates in high-definition video. The lead creditor tightened his grip on his weapon, heavily sizing me up. He tried to maintain his intimidating posture, growling through gritted teeth that Bradley owed them $2 million, and they were absolutely not leaving empty-handed. I did not blink. I told him I was perfectly aware of the debt, but I solely dictated the terms of settlement on my territory. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and calmly retrieved a crisp, formal financial document. I unfolded it slowly, ensuring the movement was steady and deliberate, and held it out toward the lead enforcer. It was a verified, certified bank draft drawn directly from my primary corporate reserve account. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before aggressively snatching the heavy paper from my hand. He held it up to the ambient security lights, his eyes rapidly scanning the authentic watermarks, the authorized signatures, and the exact printed digits. I informed him with absolute clarity that the draft covered the precise principal amount Bradley had originally borrowed to fund his spectacular offshore failures. I explicitly stated that I had surgically stripped away their exorbitant, highly illegal street interest from the total calculation. I gave them a very simple, non-negotiable choice. They could take the guaranteed, entirely clean money right now and permanently vanish from my city, or they could swing their iron crowbars, forfeit the cash entirely, and spend the next 2 decades rotting in a federal penitentiary for armed extortion and aggravated assault. The two men exchanged a long, highly calculated look. They were brutal criminals, but they were also pragmatic, profit-driven businessmen. They instantly recognized an unwinnable tactical battle when they saw one. The lead enforcer folded the bank draft with a sharp snap and slipped it into his leather jacket. He pointed a thick warning finger directly at Bradley, promising severe, lethal consequences if their paths ever crossed again. Without uttering another word to me, the two men turned their backs. They walked down the driveway, climbed into their battered utility truck, and reversed out through the ruined iron gates, disappearing into the dark street. Bradley remained frozen on his hands and knees for several agonizing seconds, staring blindly down the empty driveway. As the red taillights of the utility truck completely vanished from sight, a massive, ragged sigh of relief tore violently from his lungs. He scrambled up from the hard paving stones, aggressively wiping the pathetic mixture of cold sweat and terrified tears from his pale face. He completely ignored his wife, who was still standing on the limestone steps in a state of absolute paralyzed shock. Instead, he turned his entire focus toward me, launching into a sickening, manufactured display of profound gratitude. The feral panic instantly drained from his expression, rapidly replaced by the slick, arrogant facade of a desperate salesman who believed he had just successfully closed the most difficult deal of his entire life. He rushed forward and grabbed my hand, pumping it vigorously before I could pull away. He loudly proclaimed that my timely intervention was a beautiful testament to our unbreakable familial bond. He called me his ultimate savior. Operating on pure delusion, he quickly began spinning a brand new web of lies. He enthusiastically assured me that his current financial issues were merely a temporary liquidity crisis caused by a volatile and aggressive market fluctuation. He explicitly promised to repay every single cent of the $2 million I had just handed over to his creditors, falsely claiming his upcoming technology launch would generate unprecedented global returns. He stood tall, casually adjusting the lapels of his expensive Italian suit jacket, genuinely convinced that his chaotic nightmare was officially over. He assumed my actions were born out of a desperate, senile desire to protect my daughter's marriage. He believed he had miraculously survived the catastrophic collapse of his offshore theft with his luxurious lifestyle entirely intact. I watched his pathetic performance in absolute silence. I did not accept his handshake or his hollow praise. I firmly pulled my hand away from his grasping fingers, wiping my palm against my trousers. I did not offer a comforting smile or a single word of paternal reassurance. I reached back into my inside jacket pocket for the final time. I retrieved a thick, heavily stapled legal packet and pressed it directly and forcefully against Bradley's chest. He reflexively grabbed the paperwork, a confused, greedy smirk playing on his lips. He looked down eagerly, fully expecting to see a generous corporate loan agreement or a highly structured repayment schedule designed to save his failing business. His eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the top page. The confident smirk completely vanished, replaced by a look of utter soul-crushing devastation. I explicitly informed him that he was holding a formal, non-negotiable 48-hour eviction notice signed and authorized by a superior court judge that very afternoon. I stated with absolute surgical clarity that I had not paid off his violent private creditors to save his life. I paid them to legally absorb his debt, granting my corporate trust immediate and uncontested ownership of all his remaining financial liabilities. I explained that this aggressive legal maneuver completely severed any potential squatter's rights or marital property claims he or Monica might attempt to leverage against my estate. I looked past his horrified face and locked eyes with my daughter, who was trembling on the porch. I told them both that their grand, arrogant scheme to institutionalize me and steal my legacy had officially reached its terminal conclusion. I delivered my final, unalterable directive. They had exactly 2 days to pack whatever personal belongings fit into a single piece of luggage and vacate my property forever. Any attempt to remain past the deadline would result in their immediate, highly public arrest for criminal trespassing. I turned my back on them and walked calmly up the steps, leaving them entirely broken in the driveway. Monica snatched the thick packet from Bradley's trembling hands. Her eyes darted across the bold black text and the embossed seal of the Superior Court judge. The cold, calculating predator who had confidently orchestrated my institutionalization completely vanished in an instant. She let out a frantic, high-pitched sob and ran up the limestone steps, grabbing the sleeve of my suit jacket. She dropped to her knees on the cold stone, weaponizing her tears in a desperate attempt to manipulate my paternal instincts. She wept loudly, claiming the entire scheme was a massive, terrible mistake. She aggressively pointed her manicured finger back at her husband, who was still staring blankly at the driveway pavement. She shrieked that Bradley had forced her into the forgery. She spun a pathetic, highly rehearsed narrative claiming he had emotionally blackmailed her and threatened to leave her if she did not help him secure the $4 million to pay off his violent creditors. She sobbed that she had absolutely no choice, painting herself as a helpless, terrified victim trapped in a financially abusive marriage. She begged me to believe that she never truly intended to put me in a psychiatric facility. She clutched my arm tightly, pleading with me to cancel the eviction notice and protect her from the monster she had married. She swore she was completely innocent of the malice I suspected. I stood on the porch looking down at the daughter I had raised. Her performance was technically flawless, complete with hyperventilating gasps and trembling hands. A week ago, those tears would have broken my heart and forced me into immediate action. Tonight, they meant absolutely nothing. I did not pull my arm away. I simply reached into my tailored pocket and retrieved my mobile phone. I unlocked my phone screen and opened the encrypted audio file I had saved just minutes earlier. I turned the volume to its absolute maximum setting and pressed play. Monica's own shrill, vicious voice instantly echoed across the quiet estate grounds. The recording captured her screaming at Bradley with pure, unadulterated venom. The high-definition audio filled the cool night air, explicitly detailing the 3 agonizing days she spent locked inside my private study, perfecting my corporate signature. Her recorded voice proudly boasted about bypassing my antique desk locks and cloning my digital notary stamp to execute the fraudulent commercial mortgage. Bradley snapped his head up, staring at his wife in pure shock as her recorded voice actively claimed full credit for the criminal enterprise. The audio continued mercilessly. It broadcasted her cold, calculated rationale for placing me in a severely underfunded state-run psychiatric facility. Her recorded words clearly stated her intention to preserve my stolen wealth for her own luxury expenses, rather than paying for my legitimate medical care. The recording captured her claiming I was too old to notice the miserable living conditions she had planned for me. I pressed the button to stop the playback. The sudden silence on the porch was deafening. Monica froze instantly. Her frantic sobbing ceased. She slowly released her grip on my suit jacket and lowered her hands to her sides. The manufactured tears dried up immediately, leaving her face pale and entirely devoid of emotion. She stared at the black screen of my phone, completely paralyzed by the irrefutable evidence of her own malice. She could not blame Bradley for the words she had screamed in the privacy of her master bedroom. She had meticulously orchestrated my destruction, and her own arrogant boasting had just permanently sealed her fate. I looked down at her, feeling a profound, heavy emptiness. I broke the silence with a calm, measured tone. I reminded Monica of the grueling years before the sprawling estate, before the corporate trust, and before the luxury European cars. I explicitly detailed the freezing winter nights I spent working double shifts inspecting municipal sewer lines beneath the city streets. I told her I spent countless hours wading through toxic sludge, breathing in noxious fumes, and enduring freezing water specifically to afford the exorbitant tuition for her elite private tutoring. I broke my body daily to ensure she would never have to experience the suffocating weight of poverty I had personally endured. I provided her with every conceivable advantage, insulating her entirely from the harsh realities of financial survival. I stated clearly that my ultimate goal was to give her an unbreakable foundation of absolute security. I then pointed to the formal eviction notice still clutched in her trembling hand. I told her she took that pristine foundation of privilege and consciously weaponized it into a tool for my destruction. She did not use her expensive education to build a life of her own or contribute to the family legacy. She used it to expertly forge federal banking documents and meticulously calculate the cheapest possible way to dispose of her own father. I informed her that the most painful realization was not the potential loss of the money. It was the absolute certainty that the daughter I sacrificed my physical health to protect had grown into a parasite eager to consume my corpse. Monica did not look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the limestone steps, thoroughly crushed by the unvarnished reality of her own monstrous ingratitude. Monica slowly raised her head. The realization of her absolute destitution finally broke through her shock. She understood the estate was lost and her marriage was a toxic ruin. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning her victim narrative entirely. She switched to desperate, frantic negotiation. She begged for a second chance, pleading for a fresh start away from Bradley and his massive debts. When I remained entirely silent, her desperation escalated into a frantic demand. She asked for immediate access to her primary trust fund. She insisted she needed that specific capital to secure housing, hire legal representation, and rebuild her life. She claimed the trust was her legal birthright and demanded I authorize the release of her funds immediately. I shook my head slowly, denying her final escape route. I informed her that she possessed absolutely no legal birthright. I explained that her primary trust fund, established decades ago, was strictly governed by a comprehensive morality clause. I explicitly detailed that any documented attempt to commit elder abuse, financial fraud, or forgery against the principal benefactor constituted a catastrophic violation of that specific clause. I told her that Gregory and I had submitted the audio recording and the bank's official fraud alert to the independent trust administrators an hour ago. The morality clause had been instantly triggered without any requirement for a formal trial. I delivered the final crushing blow. Her trust fund had been completely liquidated. Every single dollar allocated for her future had been permanently and irrevocably routed to a series of heavily vetted charitable organizations dedicated to protecting vulnerable seniors from financial exploitation. I stepped back and opened the heavy oak door. I told her the 48-hour countdown was actively ticking. I stepped inside my home and locked the door securely behind me. Bradley stood in the driveway, the cold reality of the eviction notice burning in his hands. He refused to accept absolute defeat. He crushed the court-ordered document in his fist and pulled out his phone. He paced furiously across the very paving stones where he had just begged for his life. He dialed the direct line to his aggressive private litigation attorney, a man named Vance, known for utilizing dirty legal loopholes. Bradley barked orders into the receiver the moment the line connected. He demanded an immediate emergency injunction to block the 48-hour eviction mandate. He spun a frantic, fabricated narrative claiming Cornell was a mentally unstable landlord illegally attempting to throw his own family onto the street. He instructed his lawyer to weaponize squatter laws, tenant protections, and every procedural delay tactic available in the state legislature. Bradley paced like a cornered animal, his voice echoing loudly in the damp night air. He promised to pay Vance triple his usual retainer, completely ignoring the fact that he currently possessed absolutely zero liquid assets. He firmly believed he could stall the eviction long enough to find another backdoor into the corporate trust. He shouted that he had established primary residency on the estate and that no judge would enforce a sudden removal without a prolonged civil hearing. He hung up the phone with a sharp, aggressive swipe of his thumb. He turned to look at the heavy oak front door of the main house, his chest heaving with a manufactured sense of renewed confidence. He thought his aggressive legal countermeasure would buy him months of time to restructure his theft. He had absolutely no idea that his entire legal defense was about to be dismantled before it even began. Less than an hour later, a sleek silver sedan sped up the driveway, followed immediately by two marked police cruisers with their light bars silently flashing red and blue against the manicured trees. Bradley's attorney Vance stepped out of the silver sedan carrying a thick leather briefcase. He had rushed to the estate to draft the emergency injunction on site, fully expecting a standard civil dispute between a wealthy father and his entitled son-in-law. Bradley rushed toward him, launching into a rapid-fire explanation of the tenant laws he wanted to exploit. His frantic plotting was instantly cut short by the sound of heavy boots striking the pavement. Gregory stepped out from the passenger side of the lead police cruiser. He did not look like a man arriving for a civil negotiation. He looked like an executioner. He walked calmly up the driveway, flanked by three uniformed police officers. Bradley froze, his confident facade shattering instantly. Gregory completely bypassed Bradley and walked directly up to Vance. He did not offer a professional greeting. He reached into his immaculate suit jacket and retrieved a heavily bound, certified forensic audit. He thrust the document firmly against Vance's chest. Gregory stated in a cold, precise tone that the file contained irrefutable evidence of a $2 million commercial mortgage fraud. He explicitly outlined that the audit included digital tracking data verifying the exact IP address used to bypass the corporate trust firewall. He added that the packet contained high-definition scans of the forged notary stamps and the highly illegal secondary signature variations. He informed the opposing counsel that he was holding absolute proof of premeditated corporate theft. Gregory stood back, crossing his arms, allowing the crushing weight of the evidence to settle over the driveway. Vance adjusted his glasses and opened the heavy forensic audit right there under the glaring security lights of the estate. He was a ruthless litigator, but he was not a fool. His professional eyes darted rapidly across the certified banking records, the IP address logs, and the meticulously documented signature discrepancies. He flipped to the final page, reading the explicit confirmation from the federal escrow vault regarding the intercepted offshore wire transfer. The color completely drained from the attorney's face. He realized instantly that this was not a simple tenant dispute or a minor civil disagreement over family assets. He was holding a documented confession to multiple major federal felonies. Vance snapped the folder shut and shoved it back into Gregory's hands as if the paper itself were radioactive. He turned slowly to look at Bradley, his expression twisting from professional calculation into absolute disgust. Bradley stepped forward, frantically pleading with his lawyer to file the injunction anyway, claiming the audit was a complete fabrication manufactured by a senile old man. Vance did not argue. He placed his briefcase on the hood of his silver sedan and popped the brass latches open. He explicitly informed Bradley that his legal license and his freedom were entirely non-negotiable. He stated in a loud, commanding voice that he absolutely could not and would not represent a client who was actively in the process of committing federal wire fraud. He slammed his briefcase shut and locked it with a sharp, definitive click. He brutally advised Bradley to seek public counsel because no private firm in the state would touch a case with this magnitude of documented criminality. Vance opened his car door, got behind the wheel, and drove away, abandoning Bradley completely to his fate. The taillights of the lawyer's sedan disappeared into the darkness, taking Bradley's final shred of hope with them. The lead police officer stepped forward, closing the physical distance between them. He did not ask any questions or request a statement. He unclipped a folded piece of paper from his tactical vest and held it up directly into Bradley's line of sight. The officer stated in a loud, authoritative voice that he was executing an active sworn arrest warrant signed by a federal magistrate just 20 minutes prior. He recited the charges with brutal clarity. Bradley was being officially indicted for multiple counts of felony forgery, aggravated grand larceny, and attempted international wire fraud. Bradley stumbled backward, his knees trembling so violently he could barely remain standing. He shook his head frantically, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged the officers for a moment to explain, stammering wild, incoherent excuses about miscommunications and business loans. The officers did not listen. Two heavy-set deputies grabbed Bradley by his tailored shoulders and forced him to turn around. They violently kicked his legs apart and shoved him face first onto the meticulously manicured lawn he had falsely claimed to own. The cold, damp grass pressed against his cheek as the officers yanked his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed across the quiet estate. Bradley let out a high-pitched, broken sob, his face buried in the dirt. He squirmed pathetically against the restraints, utterly humiliated and completely stripped of his arrogant power. He was physically dragged up from the lawn and shoved roughly into the back of the waiting police cruiser, his luxurious lifestyle permanently traded for a cage of steel and reinforced glass. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers vanished beyond the ruined iron gates, plunging the driveway back into heavy, oppressive shadows. Monica did not chase the vehicles down the pavement. She did not scream her husband's name or beg the officers for mercy. The absolute instant the police cars disappeared from sight, her survival instinct completely overrode any lingering pretense of marital loyalty. She spun around her expensive evening gown, snapping around her ankles, and sprinted back up the limestone steps. She pushed past me without making eye contact, her breath hitching in a frantic, hyperventilating rhythm of pure self-preservation. I followed her inside, listening to the sharp clatter of her designer heels striking the imported Italian marble of the grand foyer. She ran directly past the sweeping oak staircase and hurled herself toward the master suite. She knew the federal authorities would freeze Bradley's remaining accounts by morning, leaving her entirely destitute. Her immediate strategy was to convert her tangible luxury assets into untraceable cash. She ripped open the sliding doors of her massive walk-in closet, violently sweeping designer dresses off their velvet hangers. She dragged a large leather suitcase from the top shelf and threw it open on the floor. She lunged for her glass display cases, grabbing fistfuls of diamond necklaces, thick gold tennis bracelets, and diamond-encrusted watches. She tossed them recklessly into the luggage, followed closely by a dozen limited-edition designer handbags. She was frantically calculating their street value, rapidly muttering to herself about local pawn shops and anonymous private buyers. She genuinely believed she could quickly liquidate the wardrobe I had paid for to exclusively finance her comfortable escape. She yanked the heavy zipper of the overstuffed suitcase shut and grabbed the thick leather handle, spinning around to make her desperate exit. She stopped dead in her tracks. Gregory stood perfectly still in the center of the bedroom doorway, his broad shoulders completely blocking her only path to the corridor. He did not move a single muscle as Monica demanded he step aside. Her voice shrill and trembling with rising panic. She threatened to call the police absurdly, claiming he was holding her hostage in her own bedroom. Gregory simply reached into his pristine suit jacket and retrieved a thick, notarized legal folder. He extended his arm, holding the documents directly in front of her face. He informed her with absolute icy precision that he was executing a court-ordered civil asset forfeiture. He explicitly outlined that every single diamond, every designer handbag, and every luxury garment packed inside that luggage had been purchased using capital illegally embezzled from my corporate trust accounts. He stated clearly that under federal law, those high-value items were no longer classified as personal gifts or marital assets. They were legally categorized as stolen property purchased entirely with laundered funds. He warned her that stepping out of the room with that bag would immediately constitute a secondary felony charge for the transportation of stolen goods. Monica stared at the official court seal stamped in blue ink on the paperwork, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The undeniable legal reality completely paralyzed her. Gregory reached down, took the handle of the leather suitcase from her trembling grip, and pulled it away effortlessly. He informed her that she was only permitted to keep the basic clothing currently on her back. The heavy sound of marching boots echoed up the grand staircase, entirely shattering the remaining silence of the massive house. A highly coordinated team of 6 professional financial auditors marched directly into the master bedroom. They wore matching gray jackets and carried digital scanning equipment, thick clipboards, and heavy rolls of brightly colored adhesive tags. Gregory directed them with a sharp, authoritative nod. They instantly fanned out across the room, completely ignoring Monica's horrified presence. They began slapping bright red barcode stickers onto the antique mahogany dressers, the imported silk curtains, and the plush, oversized mattress. Monica watched in absolute agony as 2 auditors efficiently dismantled her custom jewelry display, meticulously logging every stolen diamond into a federal evidence database before dropping them into heavy plastic security bags. The lead auditor marched into the hallway, loudly instructing his team to begin cataloging the lower floor. I stood beside Monica on the upper landing, forcing her to watch the systematic dismantling of her fraudulent empire. The team moved through the dining room, wrapping the massive crystal chandelier and tagging the original European oil paintings Bradley had purchased to project an illusion of generational wealth. Outside the towering front windows, the blinding lights of 2 flatbed tow trucks illuminated the driveway. Tow operators were already winching Monica's custom-imported SUV and Bradley's secondary sports car onto the steel ramps. Every single luxury vehicle, every piece of custom furniture, and every ounce of stolen prestige acquired over the last 3 years was being legally repossessed in real time. The auditors moved with ruthless efficiency, boxing up her entire fabricated reality and leaving absolutely nothing behind but the bare, echoing walls of the estate. Monica stood shivering in the center of the cavernous, empty foyer. The rich Persian rugs and velvet accent chairs had already been rolled up and hauled out the front door. She was left clutching a single small canvas bag that Gregory had rigorously inspected and approved, containing only basic toiletries and a few unbranded changes of clothes. The sprawling mansion she had confidently planned to steal was now entirely stripped of its stolen glamour, feeling as cold and hollow as her own loyalty. She looked around the barren marble hall, her shoulders shaking with defeated, pathetic sobs. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me, dropping all remaining pretense of arrogance. Her voice cracked as she demanded to know what she was supposed to do now. She aggressively asked where she was supposed to sleep tonight, claiming she had absolutely no access to credit cards, zero cash, and no friends willing to harbor a woman currently embroiled in a massive federal fraud investigation. She expected me to break. She expected the father who had worked brutal double shifts to pay for her elite education to finally show a sliver of mercy and offer her a warm guest room. I walked slowly across the empty marble floor until I stood inches from her. I reached into my trouser pocket and retrieved a single crumpled $20 bill along with a small torn piece of scrap paper. I pressed them firmly into her palm. I told her the address written on the paper belonged to a roach-infested motel on the industrial edge of the city. I informed her the $20 would cover exactly 1 night in their cheapest room. I pointed to the open front door, stepped back, and told her to get out of my house. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing the sprawling estate in absolute quiet. I stood in the massive hollow foyer for a long moment, letting the profound silence wash over me. The chaotic intrusion of federal auditors, the flashing lights of the police cruisers, and the frantic, pathetic sobs of my daughter were entirely gone. I walked into the cavernous kitchen and picked up the polished landline phone. I did not call a private chef or a luxury catering service. I dialed the number of a small family-owned diner located 3 towns over, the exact place I used to eat at during my grueling double shifts 40 years ago. I ordered a simple plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and black coffee. When the delivery driver arrived 30 minutes later, he looked entirely bewildered by the sheer scale of the property, nervously handing over the brown paper bag. I paid him generously from the same money clip that had just funded Monica's eviction and carried my modest meal into the formal dining room. I took my seat at the head of the massive, custom-built mahogany table. This was the exact spot where just days prior Bradley had slammed his fist down and explicitly ordered me to shut up. He had arrogantly declared that my opinions were obsolete and that my wealth was officially under his jurisdiction. Now the expensive crystal centerpieces were gone, packed away by the federal asset forfeiture team. The plush velvet chairs that usually seated parasitic guests were completely vacant. I unrolled the cheap paper napkin, arranged my plastic utensils, and looked down the long, empty expanse of polished wood. I was the only person left in the room, but I had never felt more in control. I ate my simple meal in absolute, unbroken silence. The cheap plastic fork scraped softly against the styrofoam container, the only sound registering in the massive space. Without the suffocating layers of imported silk drapery and oversized, gaudy luxury furniture, the acoustics of the dining room had drastically changed. Every small movement echoed sharply off the bare walls and polished hardwood floors. I slowly chewed my food, turning my gaze to survey the stripped, hollow architecture of the estate. The towering vaulted ceilings and elaborate crown molding suddenly looked ridiculous. I realized with absolute clarity that this sprawling mansion had never actually functioned as a home. It had always been a meticulously constructed monument to a family that never truly existed. I had spent millions of dollars maintaining a breathtaking theatrical stage for Monica and Bradley to perform their grotesque parody of affection. I had funded the illusion of domestic bliss, paying exorbitant maintenance costs to shelter two predators who secretly despised my presence. The grand rooms were deliberately designed to impress superficial strangers, to host lavish charity galas that generated good public relations for Bradley's failing ventures, and to physically distance the residents from one another. I had allowed myself to become a minor, silent ghost, haunting my own corridors, stepping aside to let their bloated egos consume the oxygen. Stripped of the designer rugs, the cloned antique vases, and the stolen European artwork, the house was finally honest. It was just wood, stone, and empty space. I took a slow sip of the bitter black coffee. The crushing weight of maintaining the grand deception had completely evaporated, replaced by the stark, undeniably liberating truth of my absolute solitude. I ran my hand along the smooth, dark edge of the mahogany table, feeling the cold grain beneath my fingertips. My mind drifted back 3 decades to the modest showroom where my late wife Patricia had specifically chosen this exact piece of furniture. We did not have the vast corporate trust back then. We had a fraction of the wealth, but Patricia possessed a profound, unshakable vision for our future. She had run her hands over this very wood, her eyes shining with genuine excitement. She told me she wanted a table large enough to hold decades of joyous family gatherings. She envisioned a home overflowing with loud, chaotic laughter, deeply rooted respect, and unconditional love. She wanted a place where our daughter would always feel deeply anchored and cherished. Patricia worked tirelessly beside me, managing the meager household budget while I crawled through municipal sewer lines, sacrificing her own comfort to build our foundation. She fiercely believed that wealth should be utilized as a protective shield for the family, never as a weapon. She passed away long before the corporate acquisitions multiplied our bank accounts into the stratosphere. She died holding my hand, completely blind to the dark, corrosive effect the mounting fortune would eventually have on the child she adored. I sat in the echoing room, profoundly grateful that Patricia did not live long enough to witness what the money turned our daughter into. She never had to see Monica explicitly plot my institutionalization or watch her casually forge federal documents to fund a designer lifestyle. I looked down the empty table, knowing Patricia's pure vision of family had been thoroughly corrupted by greed, but I had finally aggressively amputated the rot to preserve the foundation she built. The sharp, piercing ring of my mobile phone shattered the quiet reflection. I looked at the illuminated screen resting on the mahogany surface. It was an incoming call from an unregistered local number. I pressed the green button and held the device to my ear. Monica's voice instantly erupted through the speaker, frantic and dripping with sheer entitlement. She was calling from the front desk of the cheap Industrial Edge motel I had directed her to. She did not offer a single word of apology for her meticulous attempt to destroy my life. Instead, she immediately launched into a hysterical, breathless complaint about her current living conditions. She shrieked that the motel lobby smelled like stale smoke and industrial bleach. She vehemently protested that the clerk behind the bulletproof glass was rude, and that the room she had been assigned was completely unacceptable for someone of her social standing. Her voice hit a familiar, demanding pitch as she ordered me to send my private town car to pick her up immediately. She instructed me to book her a suite at a luxury downtown hotel, claiming she had already suffered enough indignity for one evening. I listened to her audacious demands with a heart of absolute ice. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal finality. I told her the city bus schedule was posted clearly on the corner of the motel block. I advised her to memorize the routes because public transit was her permanent reality moving forward. I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring her sudden panicked screaming, and tapped the screen to end the call. I immediately accessed the security settings and permanently disconnected the cellular line, plunging the dining room back into beautiful, untouchable silence. The morning sun broke across the city skyline as I stepped out of my private vehicle and stood before the towering glass facade of Bradley's technology startup. I walked through the sleek, automated revolving doors and took the elevator directly to the top-floor executive suite. The atmosphere inside the sprawling open-plan office was absolutely chaotic. It did not look like a revolutionary tech hub. It looked like a sinking ship. Dozens of young, exhausted software engineers and marketing directors were frantically packing their personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The ambient hum of productivity had been completely replaced by frantic whispers and hushed arguments. I bypassed the sleek reception desk and walked straight into the main bullpen. The sheer panic in the room was palpable. A young software developer approached me, his eyes bloodshot from a severe lack of sleep, demanding to know if I was another angry investor. I calmly introduced myself and stated my connection to the missing CEO. The developer let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. He pointed around the chaotic room and explicitly informed me that Bradley had completely abandoned them. He revealed that the entire staff had not received a single paycheck in over 3 months. Bradley had strung them along with empty promises of a massive incoming venture capital injection, forcing them to drain their personal savings just to survive while they built his proprietary software. He had bled his own workforce dry to fund his luxury car and Monica's designer wardrobe. I looked around the room at the young, desperate professionals. My absolute disgust for my son-in-law deepened into a cold, hardened resolve. I navigated through the labyrinth of abandoned workstations and located the executive administrative wing. A young woman with a sharp professional demeanor was systematically shredding physical documents behind a frosted glass partition. She recognized me instantly. She introduced herself as Elena Monica's former executive assistant and the only person in the building who had maintained access to Bradley's encrypted financial ledgers. She did not attempt to protect her former employers. She locked the office door, pulled up a hidden digital drive, and turned the monitor to face me. She ruthlessly dismantled the entire illusion of Bradley's technology empire. She explicitly revealed that the startup was a massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme. The proprietary software they had been developing was entirely vaporware. Bradley had never intended to launch a legitimate product. Elena pointed to the digital ledgers, showing me exactly how Bradley had specifically targeted young, working-class minority investors looking to break into the tech sector. He had preyed on their ambition, draining their modest investment groups to continually pay off his initial wealthier backers. I demanded to know how he had convinced these cautious investors to hand over their capital. Elena pulled up a highly customized marketing deck. Bradley had aggressively used my personal name, my corporate trust, and my sprawling real estate portfolio as absolute collateral. He had sold them the lie that I was personally underwriting the entire operation. My 40 years of grueling, honest labor and spotless public reputation had been weaponized to systematically defraud innocent people. I stared at the screen, understanding precisely why Bradley had been so desperate to secure the forged secondary mortgage. The walls of his criminal enterprise had been collapsing, and he needed my $4 million to plug the bleeding hole in his massive fraud. I stepped away from the glowing monitor and pulled a slim digital tablet from my inside jacket pocket. I did not hesitate. I immediately accessed the secure portal to my primary corporate trust account. The $4 million from the blocked fraudulent commercial mortgage had been successfully routed back into my secure escrow vault the previous night. I instructed Elena to instantly compile a comprehensive payroll ledger detailing every single dollar of back wages owed to the abandoned staff, including their expected severance packages and accumulated health insurance premiums. Within 10 minutes, she handed me the finalized spreadsheet. I bypassed the frozen corporate accounts entirely. I initiated a direct authorized wire transfer from my personal trust, releasing the necessary capital to completely cover the stolen payroll. I walked back out into the center of the panicked bullpen and raised my hand. I announced in a loud, commanding voice that every employee would receive their full missing wages plus a generous severance bonus in their banking accounts by the end of the business day. The room fell into stunned, echoing silence before erupting into exhausted tears and profound relief. But my task was not complete. I called my lead corporate attorney, instructing him to file an emergency legal motion. Armed with Elena's damning financial ledgers, my legal team petitioned the State Business Bureau for an immediate involuntary corporate dissolution. By utilizing my status as the falsely claimed primary guarantor, I possessed the legal authority to trigger a total liquidation protocol. With a few swift, aggressive legal maneuvers, Bradley's heavily fabricated technology corporation was entirely wiped from existence. His entire legacy was permanently reduced to a pile of shredded paper and a liquidated tax ID number. The sharp, piercing wail of approaching sirens echoed loudly through the high-rise windows before the final severance transfers even finished processing. The heavy glass doors of the executive suite violently swung open. A heavily armed team of federal agents wearing dark jackets, emblazoned with the letters of the Securities and Exchange Commission, marched into the corporate headquarters. They moved with absolute, terrifying precision. They immediately secured all exits and systematically seized every physical hard drive, laptop, and encrypted server rack in the building. The lead investigator approached me, flashing his federal credentials. He did not treat me as a suspect. My attorneys had proactively contacted his division at dawn, granting them full access to the building and transferring my status to a cooperating victim of identity theft. I handed the lead agent the encrypted flash drive I had secured from my private estate study the night before. It contained the exact, unalterable email logs and digital footprints Monica had carelessly left behind when she bypassed my antique desk locks. It held the direct written communications between Bradley and his offshore fixers, explicitly proving their intent to commit systemic grand larceny. The federal agent reviewed the file structure and nodded with grim satisfaction. He informed me that this specific drive provided the ultimate indisputable nail in Bradley's legal coffin. He explicitly stated that the combination of the Ponzi scheme, the attempted commercial mortgage fraud, and the gross violation of federal wire laws carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I watched the agents haul the servers out of the glass office. The total destruction of Bradley's fabricated world was finally complete. I turned around and walked out of the building, leaving his shattered empire firmly in the hands of federal justice. Exactly 3 months passed before the relentless machinery of the federal justice system finally brought the entire conspiracy to its absolute conclusion. The grueling high-speed investigation had meticulously dissected every fraudulent wire transfer, every fabricated investor prospectus, and every stolen signature. I arrived at the towering federal courthouse 30 minutes before the scheduled sentencing hearing. I did not bring an entourage of aggressive corporate lawyers or a team of public relations managers. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom completely alone. I bypassed the crowded front benches filled with defrauded tech investors and curious local journalists choosing to sit quietly in the very back row of the gallery. I wore a sharp, deeply understated charcoal suit projecting the quiet, impenetrable authority of a man who had built his foundation on stone, not illusions. The sprawling, high-ceilinged chamber hummed with tense, nervous energy. Federal prosecutors sat efficiently organizing their thick binders of undeniable evidence, their posture radiating absolute confidence. Across the aisle, the public defender assigned to the case looked entirely defeated before the proceedings even officially commenced. The heavy wooden side door creaked open, and a pair of armed federal marshals escorted the defendant into the room. The metallic clinking of heavy ankle chains and wrist cuffs echoed sharply over the polished hardwood floor. The sheer gravity of the moment settled heavily over the room as the presiding federal judge took his seat at the elevated bench. Bradley stood before the stern federal judge, entirely stripped of the slick, arrogant veneer he had weaponized for the past 3 years. He did not look like a revolutionary technology pioneer or a brilliant venture capitalist. He looked completely ragged, deeply exhausted, and pathetically hollow. His expensive imported Italian suits had been permanently replaced by a shapeless, faded khaki prison uniform. His skin was pale, and his shoulders sagged under the crushing weight of his inescapable reality. When the judge formally offered him the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Bradley desperately clung to his final, deeply ingrained instinct for manipulation. He gripped the edge of the wooden defense podium with trembling hands and launched into a frantic, tearful monologue. He attempted to cast himself as a well-meaning but overwhelmed entrepreneur who had simply made a series of unfortunate administrative errors under extreme market pressure. He aggressively played the victim, looking directly up at the judge with wide, desperate eyes. He claimed that every single financial risk he took, every corner he cut, and every document he altered was done solely out of a desperate desire to build a lasting generational legacy for my daughter. He painted a grotesque, entirely fabricated narrative of a young husband buckling under the immense, crushing expectations of marrying into a wealthy, established corporate dynasty. He swore that he never intended to harm anyone and that his actions were motivated entirely by misguided love and an overwhelming drive to provide. He begged the court for leniency, asking for the chance to rehabilitate himself and eventually repay the young minority investors he had systematically defrauded. The lead federal prosecutor did not bother to object or cross-examine his pathetic display of manufactured remorse. She stood up from her neatly organized table, walked calmly to the center of the courtroom, and simply tapped the screen of her digital evidence tablet. She routed the audio output directly into the courthouse's state-of-the-art public address system. The crystal-clear, high-definition recording of Bradley's own voice instantly flooded the cavernous room, completely shattering his carefully constructed illusion of innocent desperation. The audio captured his feral, arrogant shouting from the night of his failed escape. His recorded voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, aggressively mocking me as a completely senile, confused old man who had outlived his usefulness. The recording explicitly detailed his vicious, calculated plot to forge my signature, steal the $4 million in equity, and permanently lock me away in a severely underfunded, state-run psychiatrics facility. The entire courtroom listened in absolute stunned silence as Bradley's recorded voice ruthlessly outlined his intention to liquidate my estate and abandon his wife to deal with the violent fallout. The stark, horrific contrast between the weeping victim at the podium and the cold, calculating predator on the audio recording was utterly undeniable. Bradley physically shrank back, his face turning a sickening shade of gray as his own undeniable malice trapped him completely. The presiding judge leaned forward over his elevated bench, staring down at the trembling defendant with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He did not need to hear another word of defense. The malicious intent driving the massive commercial fraud had just been proven beyond any conceivable shadow of a doubt. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down the sharp crack, signaling the absolute end of Bradley's fabricated existence. He delivered a blistering reprimand, highlighting the predatory, sociopathic nature of the Ponzi scheme and the grotesque, calculated betrayal of his own family. Without a single ounce of hesitation or mercy, the judge sentenced Bradley to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, explicitly ruling out any possibility of early parole or sentence reduction. Federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Bradley by the arms and dragging him out of the courtroom through the heavy side door. The judge then turned his piercing gaze toward the back of the gallery. Monica sat perfectly still in the second-to-last row, wearing a cheap, unbranded sweater, her face completely drained of color. She had narrowly avoided a prison sentence by fully cooperating with the federal auditors and instantly surrendering every piece of stolen jewelry and luxury property. However, her cooperation did not grant her absolution. The judge formally addressed her finalized plea agreement, his voice echoing with stern authority. He explicitly condemned her active role in the forgery and her horrific willingness to institutionalize her own father for financial gain. He sentenced Monica to 5 years of severe, highly restrictive federal probation. Furthermore, he mandated 3,000 hours of grueling manual community service. She would spend the next half-decade physically cleaning the municipal parks and sweeping the very city streets I had spent 40 years building from the underground up. The poetic justice of her sentence finalized the absolute destruction of her entitlement. The court was officially adjourned, leaving the perpetrators to face the crushing reality of the consequences they had meticulously engineered. The gavel's echo faded, but its resonance followed me all the way back to the sprawling, silent estate. I pulled up the long driveway, parking my modest sedan where tow trucks had recently hauled away the remnants of a parasitic lifestyle. The house stood hollow, stripped of its stolen glamour, feeling less like a conquered territory and more like a blank canvas. I did not step inside to mourn the emptiness. I walked directly to the rear courtyard, where a team of 6 commercial contractors stood waiting with rolled blueprints and digital measuring equipment. They represented the top architectural firm in the state, expecting a lucrative contract to remodel a billionaire's mansion into an even more opulent display of wealth. The lead architect, a man named Sterling, confidently unrolled a series of schematics detailing luxury pool expansions, indoor theaters, and expanded wine cellars. He spoke rapidly about maximizing the property value and enhancing the classical aesthetic of the estate. I let him finish his meticulously rehearsed presentation before firmly rolling the blueprints back up and sliding them across the patio table. I informed Sterling that I had absolutely zero interest in superficial renovations. I did not want imported marble or upgraded entertainment systems. I looked up at the towering, pretentious structure and explicitly instructed the team to prepare for a complete structural redesign. I demanded the immediate removal of the grand ballroom, the conversion of the 5-car luxury garage into an advanced machine shop, and the gutting of the master suites to make way for high-density collaborative dormitories. Sterling stared at me in absolute shock, his professional composure shattering as he tried to comprehend why a wealthy man would deliberately dismantle his own palace. I simply told him the house was no longer a private residence. The architects exchanged bewildered glances, clearly struggling to process the radical pivot. Sterling cautiously asked what specific purpose the newly gutted facility would serve, attempting to understand the underlying logic of tearing down million-dollar aesthetics. I walked past him, running my hand along the cold, imported stone balustrade. I did not answer his question immediately. Instead, I told him exactly what it felt like to stand on the pavement outside a towering engineering firm 50 years ago, holding a perfectly drafted portfolio in my hands. I explained that I had been a brilliant, top-tier engineering graduate, possessing a mind engineered for complex structural dynamics. I detailed the crushing, absolute humiliation of walking into a highly anticipated internship interview only to watch the hiring manager's smile instantly vanish. I was explicitly denied the position, told to my face that my kind did not fit the corporate culture of their elite firm. They saw the color of my skin and immediately dismissed my intellect, tossing my blueprints into the trash. I told the contractors that I did not walk away and surrender to their prejudice. I walked directly into the municipal sewers. I spent the next 4 decades crawling through mud, laying subterranean pipes, and building a massive infrastructure empire entirely from the dirt up. Every single dollar that paid for this estate was forged in the dark, damp trenches of the city. I looked back at the bewildered architectural team. I firmly stated that I would never allow another brilliant mind to be discarded on the sidewalk. I was going to use the absolute entirety of my wealth to ensure the doors of opportunity were permanently kicked open for those the system deliberately tried to shut out. The profound weight of my history hung heavily in the crisp afternoon air, completely silencing the architect's previous objections. While Sterling frantically began recalculating the structural load-bearing walls for the new dormitory conversions, my lead attorney arrived at the courtyard carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He did not bring corporate acquisition forms or tax evasion loopholes. He brought the ultimate, irreversible mechanism of my legacy. He spread the heavy notarized documents across the patio table right over the discarded luxury blueprints. I took a solid brass pen from my pocket and leaned over the paperwork. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I systematically signed my name across 20 different legal transfer lines. With every stroke of the pen, I permanently and legally detached the massive main house, the sprawling guest wings, and the entire 50 acres of surrounding manicured land from my personal portfolio. I irrevocably transferred the total sum of the physical estate into a heavily protected, highly regulated nonprofit trust. The legal parameters of the trust were absolutely bulletproof. It explicitly prohibited any future sale, commercial liquidation, or familial inheritance of the grounds. The sprawling property Monica had so arrogantly claimed as her birthright was now legally shielded from any future predatory relatives or corrupt corporate vultures. The attorney carefully gathered the signed documents, stamping them with the official municipal seal. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had been calloused by decades of brutal physical labor. The immense fortune that had nearly destroyed my family was finally being weaponized for genuine progress. I had successfully severed the rotting branches of my bloodline to plant a completely new, unshakable root system deep into the earth. Just 2 weeks later, the deafening roar of heavy diesel machinery replaced the hollow silence of the estate. I stood on the front lawn wearing a hard hat and protective glasses, watching a massive yellow excavator position its steel claw against the front facade. The operator engaged the hydraulics, and with a thunderous crash, the enormous, pretentious marble columns that once supported Bradley's illusion of grandeur were violently torn down. Heavy clouds of white dust billowed into the air as the gaudy architectural excesses were systematically pulverized into gravel. Dozens of workers in high-visibility vests swarmed the property, hauling out the shattered remnants of the grand ballroom and replacing them with reinforced steel beams and high-capacity fiber optic cables. The estate was undergoing a brutal, magnificent metamorphosis. The sprawling, useless dining room was rapidly converted into a state-of-the-art robotics laboratory. The velvet-lined master suites were stripped down to the studs, transforming into sleek, highly functional residential dormitories. I watched the construction crews erect a massive new sign at the front of the gated driveway, completely obscuring the old family crest. The property was officially designated as the Patricia Vanguard Academy. It was a fully funded, entirely tuition-free advanced residential institute specifically dedicated to cultivating the minds of young, underprivileged African-American engineers. The sprawling grounds that had once served as a pathetic monument to greed were now a highly fortified launchpad for the next generation of brilliant innovators. I stood in the dust of the collapsing marble, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of peace. The predators had been utterly defeated, the rot had been burned away, and the foundation was finally strong enough to build a future that would outlast us all. The dust from the demolished marble columns had barely settled before I solidified my permanent living arrangement. I did not purchase a sprawling beachfront compound or secure a high-rise penthouse suite overlooking the city skyline. I packed my meager personal belongings into a single canvas duffel bag and walked the half-mile perimeter to the very rear of the property. I took up permanent residence inside the original sturdy stone guest house nestled quietly beneath the ancient oak trees. It was a modest single-story structure with solid oak floors, exposed wooden beams, and a functional wood-burning fireplace. It possessed absolutely none of the gaudy, suffocating luxury that had fatally choked the main estate. I furnished the small living room with deep, comfortable armchairs upholstered in durable canvas, entirely rejecting the imported Italian velvet that Monica had constantly obsessed over. I placed a thick, scarred butcher block table in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by mismatched wooden chairs that actually invited people to sit down and converse. The space was entirely practical, built to sustain real life rather than project a fabricated illusion of generational superiority. I meticulously arranged my old engineering textbooks and framed infrastructure blueprints on simple pine shelves. I did not hire a cleaning staff or a private cook to cater to my whims. I swept my own floors and prepared my own meals, finding a profound grounding rhythm in the daily physical maintenance of my own life. The small house smelled of fresh cedar, strong black coffee, and absolute peace. It was exactly the kind of modest home Patricia and I had originally envisioned before the corporate trusts mutated our reality. I was finally living completely on my own terms, surrounded by the quiet dignity of profound simplicity. My biological clock still operated on the brutal, unrelenting schedule of a municipal sewer engineer. I woke up precisely at dawn, long before the sun fully crested the distant city skyline. I brewed a pot of incredibly strong, bitter coffee and stepped out onto the modest wooden porch wrapping around the front of the guest house. The morning air was crisp and completely silent, save for the distant hum of the awakening city and the rustle of the oak leaves. I sat in a weathered rocking chair, wrapping my calloused hands around the warm ceramic mug and stared across the sprawling green lawns of the newly christened Patricia Vanguard Academy. Promptly at 7 o'clock, the heavy iron security gate swung open with a smooth, mechanical hum. A convoy of 3 yellow municipal buses rolled up the freshly paved driveway, followed by a steady stream of modest sedans and heavily used hatchbacks. I watched intently as the first official class of young, underprivileged engineering students stepped out onto the campus concrete. They carried heavy backpacks overflowing with advanced textbooks and clutched cheap digital tablets tightly to their chests. I looked closely at their faces. They wore expressions of absolute awe mingled with a fierce, hungry determination that I recognized instantly. They were looking at the high-tech robotics laboratories and the sprawling dormitories not as entitled heirs, but as fighters who had just been handed the exact weapon they needed to survive. I watched a young man in a faded jacket stare up at the massive steel arches of the main facility, his eyes shining with the exact same desperate ambition I had possessed 50 years ago outside that racist architectural firm. The sight completely validated every single brutal decision I had made over the past 4 months. A profound, unshakable sense of purpose settled deep into my chest as I watched the students excitedly file into the main lecture halls. For the last decade, my massive wealth had served as a toxic, isolating prison. I had been systematically reduced to a silent walking ATM, mechanically dispensing millions of dollars to fund Bradley's fraudulent corporate delusions and Monica's insatiable vanity. I had stood by and watched my hard-earned capital actively destroy the moral character of my own bloodline. Now that toxic dynamic was completely and permanently eradicated. I was no longer a silent financial hostage held captive in a hollow marble mausoleum. I walked across the campus lawn, opened the heavy steel doors, and stepped directly into the advanced machine shops. I did not stand in the back like a passive wealthy donor seeking public accolades. I rolled up my sleeves, walked right up to the drafting tables, and began aggressively teaching structural dynamics to a room full of brilliant teenagers who actually hung on my every word. I showed them how to calculate load-bearing stress, sharing the raw practical knowledge I had acquired while crawling through the city's subterranean infrastructure. I was actively forging a legacy that could never be stolen, legally manipulated, or squandered by a parasitic relative. Every single dollar of the corporate trust was now legally locked into heavily regulated educational endowments, ensuring these young engineers would graduate completely debt-free. I was arming a brand new generation with the exact intellectual capital they needed to conquer a world that actively tried to ignore them. The immense fortune that had nearly suffocated me was finally breathing real life into the community. I had successfully traded an entitled parasitic daughter for an entire academy of fiercely loyal, driven innovators. I returned to the quiet sanctuary of the guest house later that afternoon, my hands covered in chalk dust and dark machine grease. I walked up to the small aluminum mailbox mounted beside the front door and pulled out a thin stack of utility bills. Nestled tightly between the sterile commercial envelopes was a single, slightly crumpled piece of plain white stationery. It was not sealed in a custom designer envelope or stamped with a pretentious wax crest. I recognized the sharp, slanted handwriting instantly. It was from Monica. I walked into the kitchen, dropped the bills onto the butcher block table, and carefully unfolded the single sheet of paper. Her tone had undergone a massive, violent shift. The sheer arrogance that once defined her every syllable was completely gone, replaced by a raw, exhausted humility. She wrote that the federal judge had strictly enforced every single condition of her severe probation. She had explicitly been banned from seeking employment in the financial sector or any luxury industry. She confessed that she was currently working a grueling minimum wage shift at a heavily trafficked commercial laundromat just to cover the weekly rent at her cheap motel. She described the excruciating physical agony of standing on her feet for 10 hours a day, sweeping floors and washing industrial linens to fulfill her mandatory community service requirements. She finally understood the brutal reality of the physical labor I had endured to build her childhood. She did not ask for a single dollar. She did not request a high-priced legal intervention or complain about the gross unfairness of her brutal living conditions. The letter ended with a hesitant, almost fearful request. She simply asked if I would be willing to meet her for a cheap cup of coffee at a public diner whenever I felt ready. The diner was a loud, unpretentious establishment situated squarely in the working-class district of the city. The harsh fluorescent lighting illuminated the worn vinyl booths and linoleum floors, leaving absolutely no room for manufactured glamour. I arrived 15 minutes early and selected a corner booth, ordering 2 black coffees from a waitress who called everyone honey. The heavy glass door chimed, cutting through the clatter of silverware and the low hum of exhausted patrons ending their shifts. I watched Monica walk into the diner. The transformation was physically jarring. The perfectly tailored designer gowns and $1,000 blowouts had vanished entirely. She wore a shapeless, faded blue uniform shirt bearing the stitched logo of the commercial laundromat. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical knot, completely free of styling products or expensive extensions. She scanned the room with a hesitant, almost fearful posture, her shoulders curled inward as if expecting a physical blow. She spotted me in the corner and approached the table with slow, deliberate steps. As she slid into the booth across from me, she rested her hands on the scarred laminate table. I stared at her fingers. The immaculate French manicures were gone. Her nails were filed down to the quick, and the skin across her knuckles was red raw and cracked from constant exposure to industrial bleach and hot water. These were the hands of a woman who had finally been forced to touch the brutal, unyielding reality of actual manual labor. The sheer physical toll of her probation had stripped away every ounce of her artificial arrogance. She did not look like the entitled heiress who had tried to steal my life. She looked like a profoundly exhausted woman simply trying to survive the day. Monica stared at the steaming mug of black coffee sitting between us, visibly struggling to find the right words. In the past, she would have instantly dominated the conversation with aggressive demands, weaponizing her elite vocabulary to manipulate the narrative. Now she simply kept her gaze lowered, her raw fingers tracing the thick ceramic rim of the cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, lacking any trace of the shrill entitlement that used to define her. She explicitly stated that she was not there to ask for financial assistance, a loan, or a legal bailout. She knew I had legally blocked every avenue of corporate rescue, and she had finally accepted the absolute finality of that decision. Instead, she asked for the one thing I never expected her to seek. She asked for my forgiveness. She recounted the grueling reality of her daily 10-hour shifts at the laundromat, explaining how the relentless, mind-numbing physical exhaustion had completely shattered her delusions. She confessed that hitting absolute rock bottom had forced her to examine the hollow, parasitic nature of her marriage to Bradley. She admitted that her entire existence had been entirely superficial, built on a foundation of stolen money, fake prestige, and a horrific willingness to sacrifice her own father for social status. The crushing isolation of her current reality had laid bare the grotesque cruelty of her actions. She wept softly, the tears sliding down her pale, unadorned cheeks hitting the laminate table. She acknowledged that she had actively plotted to lock me in a psychiatric facility simply to maintain her designer wardrobe. She owned the sheer monstrousness of her betrayal without offering a single excuse, waiting in the harsh diner lighting for my judgment. I sat in the hard vinyl booth and studied the broken woman weeping across from me. I did not feel the immediate burning anger that had fueled my ruthless corporate dismantling of Bradley's empire. Looking past the raw hands and the cheap uniform, my mind instantly flashed back 30 years. I briefly saw the innocent, fiercely determined little girl who used to sit at my drafting table eagerly watching me draw municipal pipe schematics. That child had possessed a genuine curiosity and a kind heart, qualities that were systematically suffocated by the immense insulating wealth I had mistakenly poured over her life. The money had acted as a corrosive acid, eating away her empathy and replacing it with a predatory arrogance. Seeing a faint glimmer of that original uncorrupted child trying to claw her way back to the surface broke my heart, but it did not weaken my absolute resolve. I leaned forward and spoke with calm, unyielding clarity. I told Monica that I heard her confession and that I recognized the profound pain of her current reality. However, I explicitly stated that true forgiveness is not a simple, instantaneous transaction finalized over a cheap cup of diner coffee. It is a brutal, lifelong process of behavioral reconstruction. I refused to grant her absolute absolution just because she had finally experienced the harsh consequences of her own malice. I warned her that a few months of manual labor did not erase years of calculated sociopathic betrayal. I told her I would not offer her an emotional shortcut to ease her conscience. She had to sit with the agonizing weight of her actions, carrying that guilt until her daily choices proved that her fundamental character had permanently and undeniably changed. Monica absorbed my harsh assessment without protest, her shoulders dropping as she accepted the heavy reality of my terms. She wiped her face with a coarse paper napkin, nodding in silent, painful agreement. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a simple leather wallet. I dropped a $5 bill onto the table to cover the coffees, leaving a generous tip for the overworked waitress. I then retrieved a small plain white business card and slid it slowly across the laminate surface until it rested inches from Monica's raw, cracked fingers. I explained that the card contained the direct contact information for a modest blue-collar logistics firm located on the industrial side of the city. The company was currently looking for reliable entry-level freight dispatchers to work the overnight shift. The job offered absolutely zero prestige, no corporate benefits, and a wage that would barely cover the rent of her dingy motel room. It was not a magical rescue or a backdoor into the corporate elite. It was simply an opportunity to execute honest, grinding work in an environment where her last name carried absolutely no weight. I looked directly into her tear-streaked eyes and told her that if she truly wanted to rebuild her life, she had to start completely from the dirt exactly as I had done 50 years ago. I instructed her to stop looking for wealthy saviors and begin laying her own structural concrete. I stood up from the booth adjusting my jacket. I did not offer a comforting hug or a promise of future rescue. I told her the rest of her life was entirely in her own hands, turned my back on the table, and walked out of the diner into the cool night air. The drive back from the industrial district was solitary and quiet. Cornell watched the urban decay slowly give way to the manicured familiar streets leading back to the estate. As he turned his modest sedan through the heavy iron gates of the Patricia Vanguard Academy, the fading sun was already casting long golden shadows across the active campus. The stark cold marble columns that once defined the property were completely gone, replaced by the warm, vibrant energy of genuine human endeavor. He parked his car near the edge of the sprawling lawn and killed the engine. As he stepped out into the crisp evening air, the sound of the campus hit him. It was not the oppressive, manufactured silence of a sprawling mansion hiding bitter resentment. It was the rich, dynamic symphony of life. Dozens of young, driven students were gathered on the newly constructed patios. He could hear the sharp, enthusiastic cadence of their voices as they debated complex engineering blueprints, their laughter ringing clearly across the open courtyards. The heavy, suffocating isolation that had plagued him for years evaporated completely in the presence of their raw ambition. These were the minds he had chosen to invest in the future he was actively building with the wealth that had nearly destroyed his bloodline. He paused on the concrete pathway, simply absorbing the atmosphere. He watched a group of freshmen point excitedly at a digital rendering on a tablet, completely oblivious to the man who had funded their education standing in the shadows. He felt a profound grounding shift in his chest. The transition from a silent, discarded patriarch to the silent architect of their success was finally complete. He continued his walk past the bustling main dormitories and followed the winding stone path to the rear of the property. The sturdy, unassuming stone guest house sat quietly beneath the protective canopy of ancient oak trees entirely separated from the academic clamor. He unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside the modest sanctuary. The scent of aged cedar and lingering coffee grounds greeted him immediately. He reached out and dropped his car keys onto the simple wooden credenza resting in the narrow hallway. The sharp metallic clatter of the keys striking the wood felt remarkably final, a definitive punctuation to the agonizing chapter he had just closed at the diner. He walked slowly into his small study and sat down behind his battered oak desk. His gaze fell directly upon the silver-framed photograph of Patricia sitting beside his desk lamp. In the picture, she was smiling with that fierce, unyielding warmth that had anchored him through decades of grueling municipal labor. He studied the familiar lines of her face, allowing the heavy weight of the last 4 months to finally settle into perspective. He knew with absolute certainty that she would not judge the brutal, unyielding boundaries he had been forced to establish. She would understand exactly why he had to amputate the toxic entitlement rotting their family tree to save the roots. She had always demanded honesty over comfort and accountability over empty privilege. He traced the edge of the silver frame with his calloused thumb. He had dismantled the grotesque empire their daughter had tried to steal, and in its place, he had resurrected the pure foundational values Patricia had championed until her dying breath. Her unwavering gaze in the photograph offered him the silent, profound validation he deeply required. Leaning back in his sturdy leather desk chair, Cornell stared out the window into the gathering twilight. The frantic, high-stakes warfare of corporate takeovers, federal indictments, and severe probation sentences had demanded every ounce of his strategic intellect. Yet sitting in the quiet comfort of his self-made refuge, the ultimate realization washed over him with crystal clarity. The sweeping, calculated destruction of his son-in-law's fraudulent Ponzi scheme was never truly about enacting vengeance. The deliberate, methodical decision to sever his daughter's financial lifeline was never about inflicting malicious punishment upon her. Those outcomes were simply the brutal, necessary mechanics of survival. His true victory lay entirely in the fierce reclamation of his own fundamental dignity. For years he had allowed his immense wealth to paralyze his judgment, silently accepting the suffocating role of a discarded, obsolete elder. He had surrendered his voice and his authority, permitting a pair of parasitic predators to treat him as a disposable asset merely waiting to expire. By stepping into the fire and aggressively tearing down the magnificent deception they had built around him, he had shattered that pathetic narrative forever. He had unequivocally refused to fade quietly into the shadows of his own estate. He had actively reclaimed his agency, deploying his intellect and his resources to reestablish his absolute sovereignty. The fortune that had acted as a corrosive poison was now serving as a powerful instrument of justice. He was no longer a victim of his own success or a passive hostage to ungrateful heirs. He was a man who had confronted the darkest, most painful reality of his own family and emerged with his honor entirely intact. His wealth no longer defined him. His unshakable principles did. Cornell stood up from the desk, leaving the quiet reflection of the study behind. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped back out onto the modest front porch of the guest house. The evening air had cooled significantly, carrying the faint metallic scent of the nearby machine shops. As he leaned against the wooden railing, the sound of hurried footsteps approached along the stone pathway. A young student clutching a heavily annotated drafting blueprint jogged up to the edge of the porch. The teenager stopped abruptly, his posture radiating a deep, immediate respect. He nervously apologized for the intrusion, holding up the schematics. He explained that his study group had been struggling for the last 2 hours to balance a complex structural equation regarding load-bearing steel tension, and they desperately needed an experienced perspective. Cornell looked at the young man, seeing the sheer, unadulterated hunger for knowledge burning in his eyes. He did not dismiss the student or direct him back to a faculty advisor. A warm, genuine smile broke across Cornell's face. He reached out his calloused hand, took the blue paper, and gestured for the young man to step up onto the porch under the warm glow of the overhead light. He began to meticulously break down the mathematical variables, his voice steady and authoritative as he shared the practical wisdom of a lifetime spent building municipal infrastructure. He had left his car keys on the credenza and permanently walked away from the hollow, superficial existence that had nearly buried him. He had chosen to build a far superior reality. The cold, oppressive silence of the empty mansion was entirely gone, replaced permanently by the vibrant, resounding peace of a legacy actively being forged. Did you find value in this story of reclaiming dignity and building a lasting legacy? What would you have done if you were in Cornell's position? Share your thoughts and join the discussion in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our powerful life lessons. Thank you for your support, and we will see you in the next video.